Working as a small-town cop has its moments. Most of them aren't great. Paperwork, dealing with petty nonsense, and listening to people complain about their neighbors being too loud or parking wrong. But every now and then, something comes along that shakes you to your core, makes you question what's really out there in the darkness. It was 2003 when it happened. Summer had settled over Oklahoma like a hot, wet blanket. I remember because I had just moved back home after a few years trying to make it in the city. My name's Michael Reynolds. Mike to most people around here. I came back because I thought life would be quieter in Sutton Creek. Simpler. The town hadn't changed much since I left. Same dusty main street with its handful of stores. Same diner where Martha still served the best apple pie in 3 counties. Same old men sitting outside the barber shop, discussing weather patterns and cattle prices. Time moves differently here, like the town exists in its own little bubble, separate from the rest of the world. I took a job with the local sheriff's department, figuring I'd eventually take over when Sheriff Morris retired. But the old man showed no signs of slowing down, despite pushing 70. He'd been sheriff since before I was born, knew every family, every secret this town held. Or at least he thought he did. "You're too antsy, Mike," he told me my first week back. "City life's made you soft. Out here, we got a different pace." That different pace meant most days were filled with routine patrols, speeding tickets, and breaking up the occasional bar fight at the Rusty Nail. Sometimes we'd get a domestic disturbance call, or teenagers causing trouble at the abandoned mill on the edge of town. Nothing I couldn't handle with my eyes closed. The station itself was a small, brick building just off Main Street, with 3 desks, a pair of holding cells, and a coffee machine that produced something closer to motor oil than coffee. Dispatch was handled by Betty Walsh, a woman in her 50s who knew everyone's business and could talk your ear off if you let her. "Good morning, Michael," she said every day as I walked in. Never Mike, always Michael. Sheriff's already gone out to check on that fence dispute at the Johnson place. That particular morning, July 23rd to be exact, started like any other. The air conditioning was struggling against the summer heat, and I was finishing up paperwork from a drunk and disorderly the night before. I remember looking at my watch, thinking I might head out to lunch early. That's when the call came in. Betty's voice cut through the quiet of the station. "Mike, got something for you." Her usual cheerful tone was replaced with something more serious. "Some campers haven't returned. Families getting worried." I looked up from my desk. "Missing persons?" "Group of 4, Betty said, flipping through her notes. 2 couples from the city, camping out near Sutton Creek. Were supposed to return yesterday, no contact since Saturday." I nodded, taking the details down. Names, ages, vehicle description. "Probably just lost track of time," I said, but something about Betty's expression made me uneasy. "The brother of one of them drove up to their campsite this morning, found their car still there but no sign of anyone. Said something felt wrong." There it was. That feeling. The one cops develop after years on the job. That little voice telling you something isn't right, even when there's no reason to think so. "I'll check it out," I said, grabbing my keys. Sheriff Morris walked in just as I was heading out, his weathered face creased with its permanent half-smile. "Where you off to in such a hurry?" I filled him in on the missing campers, expecting him to take over. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Go check it out, Mike. It's probably just a couple of city slickers who got themselves turned around." His casual dismissal bothered me, but I didn't argue. Morris didn't take much seriously, unless it involved his lunch break or a major crime. Missing campers didn't qualify as either. As I drove out of town, the scenery gradually changed from weathered buildings to open farmland, and finally to the dense woods that surrounded Sutton Creek. The forest had always made me uneasy, even as a kid. There was something about the way the trees grew so close together, creating shadows where the sun never reached. Something about the silence that seemed to swallow sounds. The road narrowed, became unpaved, and I had to slow down to navigate the ruts and bumps. My police radio crackled with static, the signal growing weaker the deeper I went. By the time I reached the small parking area that marked the trailhead, it was nearly useless. I parked beside a blue Subaru Outback, the missing camper's car, according to the license plate. Everything looked normal. No broken windows, no signs of struggle. Just a car waiting for owners who hadn't returned. The air was thick with humidity as I stepped out, the weight of my gun at my hip oddly reassuring. Birds called to each other overhead, and insects buzzed in the underbrush. Normal forest sounds. So why did the hair on the back of my neck stand up? "McKay, checking out the last known location," I said into my radio, forgetting for a moment that I'd changed my name when creating this report. "No sign of the campers yet." Betty's voice came back garbled. Something about checking in soon, but the signal was terrible. I grabbed my flashlight despite the daylight. The forest got dark quick under the canopy and started down the trail. The path was well worn but narrow, forcing me to walk single file between the towering oaks and pines. My boots crunched on fallen leaves and twigs, the sound seeming to echo in the unusual stillness of the forest. I'd been walking for maybe 30 minutes when I began to wonder if I'd missed the campsite somehow. Then I smelled it. Smoke. Faint, but distinctive. I followed the scent off the main trail, pushing through some bushes until I came to a small clearing. 2 tents stood there, a modern camping setup with a fire pit in the center. But something was wrong. The chairs were knocked over, like someone had left in a hurry. A cooler lay on its side, beer cans scattered across the ground. An open map fluttered against a tree trunk, held in place by a single pushpin. The fire pit contained only cold ashes. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here? Sheriff's Department?" My voice seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the trees. No echo, no response. I approached one of the tents and unzipped the entrance. Inside, sleeping bags were still laid out. A paperback novel rested on one, open to the middle, as if the reader had just stepped away. A cell phone sat on top of a backpack, dead or out of signal. The second tent told a different story. The entrance had small dark stains. I touched one with my finger, then rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger. Dried blood. Not a lot, but enough to raise alarm bells. I stepped back, surveying the campsite with growing concern. These people hadn't just wandered off. Something had happened here. That's when I noticed the trail leading away from the campsite, into the denser part of the forest. The ground was disturbed, the undergrowth trampled. It looked like something, or someone, had been dragged. I radioed in what I'd found, but got only static in response. I was on my own, at least for now. Common sense told me to go back, get help, bring a search party. But the thought of those 4 people, possibly hurt, possibly dying somewhere in these woods, pushed me forward. I couldn't wait. So I followed the trail, unaware that I was walking towards something beyond my understanding, something that would change me forever. The trail wasn't difficult to follow. Whatever had happened at the campsite, it hadn't been subtle. Broken branches, disturbed earth, occasional dark stains that I tried not to think too much about. The path led deeper into the forest, away from the established hiking trails, and into territory that felt increasingly wild and untouched. The farther I went, the more the forest seemed to change around me. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out more and more of the sky. The pleasant sounds of birds and insects faded until all I could hear was my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the forest floor. I checked my watch. I'd been walking for almost an hour. The campsite was far behind me now, and I had to make a decision. Continue forward into increasingly difficult terrain, or turn back and wait for backup. The trail suddenly veered sharply to the left, down a slight incline toward a small stream. As I made my way carefully down the slope, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I stumbled, nearly falling. I caught myself against a tree trunk, my hand coming away sticky with some kind of sap. Except it wasn't sap. It was dark red, almost black in places. Blood. There was blood on the trees. Not just a small amount like at the tent, but long smears of it like someone had painted the trunks with crimson hands. My stomach churned. I'd seen plenty of blood in my years as a cop, but something about finding it out here, in the silence of the forest, made it more disturbing. I drew my weapon, suddenly aware of every sound, every shadow. The logical part of my brain said this was likely the result of an animal attack. Maybe the campers had encountered a bear or mountain lion. But another part of me, a more primitive part, whispered that something else was happening here. Something worse. The trail of disturbed earth continued down to the stream, where it disappeared into the water. I scanned both banks but couldn't see where it emerged on the other side. Whoever or whatever had made this trail was smart enough to use the water to cover their tracks. I holstered my weapon and took out my phone. No signal, as expected. I tried the radio again, but got only static. I was completely cut off. Looking at the stream, I made a decision. I would cross and search the opposite bank for any sign of the trail continuing. If I found nothing within 15 minutes, I'd head back and bring a proper search party. The water was cold as it soaked through my boots, rising just above my ankles at its deepest point. The current wasn't strong, but the rocks were slippery, and I moved carefully to avoid falling. Halfway across, I noticed something caught between two rocks. At first, I thought it was just a clump of leaves or debris, but as I got closer, I realized it was fabric. I reached down and pulled it free. It was a torn piece of clothing, a fragment of a red flannel shirt soaked with water and something darker. One of the missing campers had been wearing a shirt like this, according to the description I'd received. I stuffed the fabric into my pocket and continued across the stream, now scanning the opposite bank with renewed urgency. There, about 20 yards downstream, I found what I was looking for. The trail continued, even more pronounced now. Whatever had made it wasn't trying to hide anymore. The blood on the trees became more frequent, sometimes just smears, sometimes distinct handprints. Human handprints. My grip tightened on my gun as I followed the trail deeper into the woods. The terrain became rougher, with rock outcroppings interrupting the dense forest. The trail led toward one of these formations, a jumble of boulders that rose like a small cliff from the forest floor. As I approached, I noticed an opening between the rocks, a narrow crevice that might lead inside or through the formation. The trail headed straight for it. I paused, listening. The silence of the forest was absolute now. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind in the trees. Just a heavy stillness that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. Drawing my weapon again, I approached the crevice. It was narrow but passable, leading into darkness. I took out my flashlight and shone it inside. The beam revealed a passage between the rocks, wide enough for a person to walk through sideways. It extended beyond the reach of my light. Every instinct told me not to go in there, to go back, get help, return with more officers. But what if one of the campers was inside, injured but alive? Every minute could count. I squeezed into the crevice, my back against one rock wall, my chest almost touching the other. The passage extended about 15 feet before opening into a larger space. I made my way carefully, keeping my flashlight beam directed ahead and my gun ready. The air inside was noticeably cooler and carried a strange odor, musty and organic like rotting vegetation, but with an underlying scent I couldn't identify. Something metallic and wrong. When I reached the end of the narrow passage, I found myself in a small chamber within the rock formation. My flashlight revealed a space about the size of a small bedroom, with a dirt floor and walls of natural rock. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, creating a slow, rhythmic sound. And there, in the center of the chamber, was evidence that my worst fears were justified. A backpack lay on the ground, torn open, its contents scattered. A water bottle, a compass, a small first aid kit. Next to it, a camera, the lens shattered. A wallet, open, driver's license still visible. Jeffrey Winters, 32, from Oklahoma City, one of the missing campers. But Jeffrey was nowhere to be seen. The ground around the backpack was dark with dried blood, more than could come from a minor injury. A lot more. And there were marks in the dirt. Drag marks, like those I'd been following, leading to the back of the chamber, where the flashlight beam couldn't quite reach. I stepped forward cautiously, sweeping the light around the space. There were more openings in the rock walls, smaller passages leading deeper into the formation. The dragging marks headed toward one of these. I approached it slowly, every sense on high alert. This passage was larger than the entrance, wide enough to walk through normally, but it descended at a steep angle, like a natural staircase leading underground. The smell was stronger here, that unidentifiable wrongness growing more intense. My beam revealed rough stone steps descending into darkness. I hesitated. Going down there alone would be foolish. I needed backup, proper equipment. But before I could turn to leave, I heard something. A sound from below. Faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. A human voice, moaning in pain. Someone was down there, alive. I keyed my radio one more time, desperate for contact. "This is Deputy Reynolds. I'm at a rock formation approximately 3 miles northeast of the campsite. I've found evidence of the missing campers and what sounds like a survivor. I'm proceeding to investigate. Need immediate backup." Nothing but static answered me. I had no choice. I couldn't leave someone down there suffering while I spent hours going back for help. I pointed my flashlight down the passage and began to descend. The natural stairway twisted as it went down, the walls pressing close on either side. I counted the steps as I went. 20, 30, 50. How deep did this go? The air grew colder and damper with each step. Water trickled down the rock walls, forming small puddles that I had to step around. The smell intensified, that mixture of decay and something else, something that made my skin crawl. After about 100 steps, the passage leveled out and opened into another chamber, much larger than the one above. My flashlight couldn't illuminate the entire space, but what it did reveal made my blood run cold. This was no natural cave, at least not entirely. The walls showed signs of deliberate excavation, rough but purposeful. Crude shelves had been cut into the rock, holding objects I couldn't immediately identify. The floor had been partially leveled, though it was still uneven in places. And there, against the far wall, was a human form. I rushed forward, momentarily forgetting caution in my relief at finding one of the missing campers. But as I got closer, that relief transformed into horror. It was Jeffrey Winters, or what remained of him. He was still alive somehow, despite injuries that should have been fatal. His chest rose and fell with shallow, labored breaths. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. And his body. I won't describe in detail what had been done to him. Some memories are better left buried. But I will say this: it wasn't the work of any animal I knew. The precision of it, the deliberate nature of the wounds, spoke of something with intelligence. Something that knew exactly how to keep a human being alive while systematically taking them apart. "Jeffrey," I said, kneeling beside him, careful not to touch his ruined body. "Jeffrey, can you hear me?" His eyes moved, focusing on my face with obvious effort. His lips moved, but no sound came out. I leaned closer. "I'm going to get you out of here. Just hold on." He managed to whisper something then, so faint I almost missed it. "Run." A sound behind me, a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across stone. I turned, raising my flashlight and gun together. The beam caught movement at the edge of the chamber, where another passage opened into darkness. Something was emerging, something large. My flashlight illuminated it in fragments. A limb here, a twisted joint there, a surface that might have been skin but looked wrong somehow, too tight, too smooth in some places and rough in others. I fired a warning shot, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. "Police, don't move." The thing paused. Then it stepped fully into the light, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It stood on 2 legs, roughly humanoid in its overall shape. But that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its limbs were too long, too thin in some places, and bulging with unnatural muscle in others. The joints bent in ways that human joints don't. Its skin was a patchwork, some areas hairless and pale, others covered with coarse, dark hair. But it was the face that haunted me afterward. Not because it was monstrous, but because it was almost human. Almost. Like something had tried to create a human face without ever having seen one, working only from a vague description. The features were in approximately the right places, but everything was subtly wrong. The eyes too wide apart, the mouth too large, with teeth that didn't match. No nose, just 2 slits in the center of the face. It tilted its head as it looked at me, like a curious dog. But there was nothing dog-like about the intelligence I saw in those eyes. They were coldly assessing, calculating. For one frozen moment we stared at each other, the thing and I. Then it moved. I've never seen anything move that fast. One moment it was at the edge of the chamber, The next it was halfway to me. I fired twice, the bullet striking center mass. The thing staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it made a sound, a high, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the stone walls until I wanted to clamp my hands over my ears. I fired again, aiming for the head this time. The shot went wide as the creature lunged, covering the remaining distance between us in a single bound. Its weight hit me like a truck, sending me sprawling. My flashlight went flying, landing on the stone floor with the beam pointing away, casting crazy shadows across the ceiling. My gun was still in my hand, but the creature had pinned my arm. Its face was inches from mine now, that almost human visage horrifying in its wrongness. I could smell its breath, like meat left too long in the sun. Those not quite right eyes stared into mine with terrible intelligence. One clawed hand raised, poised to strike. I thought, this is it. This is how I die, in a hole in the ground, torn apart by something that shouldn't exist. But in that moment, Jeffrey Winters found some last reserve of strength. With a ragged cry, he launched himself from the wall, his broken body somehow propelling itself across the small distance to slam into the creature's side. The thing whirled, its attention diverted. It was all the chance I needed. I brought my gun up and fired directly into its face from point-blank range. The creature reeled backward, making that awful keening sound again. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my flashlight, and fired twice more. The bullet seemed to have an effect this time. The thing retreated, moving back toward the passage it had emerged from. I pulled Jeffrey's limp form behind me, placing myself between him and the creature. I kept firing until my magazine was empty, forcing the thing back step by step. When I ran out of bullets, I prepared myself for the creature's attack. But it didn't come. Instead, the thing watched me from the shadows, its breathing a raspy, wet sound in the darkness. Then, with one last look from those terrible eyes, it turned and disappeared down the passage. I didn't waste time wondering why it had retreated. I reloaded my weapon, then turned to Jeffrey. He was dead, his last act having been to save my life. There was nothing I could do for him now except bring his body back and tell his story. I gathered him up as gently as I could and began the long climb back to the surface, my flashlight beam dancing wildly ahead of me, every shadow seeming to hold another horror waiting to pounce. By some miracle, I made it out of the rock formation and back into the forest. The daylight was fading now, the woods taking on the deep gloom of evening. I managed to reach the campsite again, where I gently placed Jeffrey's body on the ground. There was no sign of the other 3 campers, and I knew in my heart that I wouldn't find them alive either. Whatever that thing was, it had been methodical in its hunt. As I stood there, trying to decide my next move, I heard something that made my heart leap, voices calling my name, flashlight beams cutting through the growing darkness. The search party had come looking for me. I called back, waving my arms, relief flooding through me. I wasn't alone anymore. But as the first members of the search party reached the campsite, I realized something. How could I possibly explain what I had seen? Who would believe me? So I didn't try. I told them about finding signs of a struggle, following the trail, discovering the rock formation, and Jeffrey's body inside. But I described his injuries as the work of an animal attack, possibly a bear or mountain lion. I said nothing about the chamber deep underground, or the creature with the almost human face. We carried Jeffrey's body back to the trailhead, where an ambulance was waiting. The search for the other campers would continue tomorrow with a larger team. As I sat in the back of a patrol car, a blanket around my shoulders and a cup of coffee in my hands, Sheriff Morris approached me. "You did good work today, Mike," he said, his weathered face grave. "Found one of them at least." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The sheriff looked out at the dark forest, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he asked, "What do you think happened out there?" I hesitated. "Animal attack," I said finally. "Something big, vicious." Morris kept staring at the trees. "Yeah," he said, "something like that." His tone made me look up sharply. There was something in his voice, a certain knowledge. Had he seen it too, sometime in his long years as sheriff? Did he know what really lurked in Sutton Creek Forest? But he said nothing more, just patted my shoulder and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the memory of those two intelligent eyes staring into mine. The search resumed at dawn the next day. A dozen officers from our department and neighboring counties, along with volunteer search and rescue teams, gathered at the trailhead. The atmosphere was somber. News of Jeffrey Winters' death had spread, though the details remained vague. Animal attack was the official line, and no one questioned it openly. I was assigned to lead one of the search teams back to the rock formation. Despite my exhaustion and the lingering terror of the previous day, I didn't protest. I needed to go back. I needed to know if the other campers could still be saved, though I held little hope. As we hiked through the forest, retracing my steps from yesterday, I found myself jumping at every sound, scanning the trees constantly. The other officers noticed my tension, but attributed it to the trauma of finding Jeffrey's body. They had no idea what I was really looking for, what I was really afraid of. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less oppressive, more ordinary. Birds sang in the branches, squirrels darted across our path. Normal forest life had resumed, as if yesterday's horror had been nothing but a bad dream. When we reached the rock formation, I braced myself, but the narrow crevice I'd entered yesterday was empty, the larger chamber beyond undisturbed, except for bloodstains and Jeffrey's scattered belongings. And the passage leading down? It was gone. Not blocked, not hidden. Gone. The rock wall was solid, with no sign that an opening had ever existed. I ran my hands over the stone, disbelieving, while my fellow officers watched with concern. "Reynolds, you okay?" asked Wilson, one of the deputies from a neighboring county. I stepped back from the wall, my mind racing. Had I imagined it all? No, Jeffrey's body was real enough. His injuries were real. And yet, "I thought there was another passage," I said lamely. "Must have been mistaken." We searched the entire rock formation and the surrounding forest, but found no trace of the other campers or the creature I'd encountered. It was as if they had simply vanished. By late afternoon, the search was called off. The official report would list 3 campers as missing, presumed dead from an animal attack that had claimed Jeffrey Winters' life. Case closed. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen in that underground chamber. I knew those eyes, that almost human face would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. That night, alone in my small apartment on the edge of town, I sat with a bottle of whiskey and tried to make sense of what had happened. My shoulder throbbed where the creature had slammed me to the ground, the bruises a vivid reminder that I hadn't imagined the encounter. I must have fallen asleep in my chair, because suddenly I was back in that underground chamber, face to face with the creature. But this time it spoke. "You saw," it said, its voice a raspy whisper that seemed to come from inside my own head. "You shouldn't have seen." I jerked awake, heart pounding, sweat soaking my shirt. The digital clock on my microwave read 3:17 a.m. The bottle of whiskey was empty beside me. Just a nightmare, I told myself. Just a nightmare. But when I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed water on my face, I noticed something in the mirror that made my blood run cold. A small cut on my cheek, fresh and beating with blood, exactly where the creature's claw had brushed my face in the dream. I backed away from the mirror, panic rising in my throat. Was I losing my mind? Or was the thing somehow reaching me even here, in the safety of my own home? I didn't sleep again that night. I sat by the window, gun in hand, watching the street below until dawn broke over the houses of Sutton Creek. The next day at the station, I must have looked as bad as I felt. Betty took one look at me and wordlessly pushed a cup of coffee into my hands. Sheriff Morris called me into his office. "I'm putting you on leave," he said without preamble as I sat down across from his desk. 2 weeks, paid. You need some rest after what happened out there. I started to protest, but he held up a hand. "This isn't a request, Reynolds. You look like hell, and I need my deputies functioning at 100%. His expression softened slightly. "What you saw out there, it can take a toll. Take some time. Process it." There it was again, that hint that he knew more than he was saying. I leaned forward. "Sheriff, what exactly do you think I saw out there?" Morris held my gaze for a long moment, then sighed heavily. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a bottle and 2 glasses. He poured a finger of amber liquid into each and pushed one toward me. "It's a bit early for this," he said, "but I think we both need it." He downed his in one swallow, and after a moment's hesitation, I did the same. The whiskey burned pleasantly on the way down. "I've been sheriff in this town for 43 years, Morris said, setting his glass down. "Seen a lot of strange things in that time, things that don't fit neatly into police reports." I waited, hardly daring to breathe. "Sutton Creek Forest has always had incidents," he continued. "People going missing, strange animal attacks, hunters finding game that's been killed and arranged in ways that animals don't do." He poured himself another drink but didn't touch it. "Back in '72, we had a similar case. Group of college kids camping, 3 disappeared, 1 survived. Man named Howard Wilson. He told a wild story about something in the woods that wasn't human but wasn't animal either. Something that walked on 2 legs but moved wrong. Something with eyes that knew you." I felt a chill run down my spine. It was the same, exactly the same. "What happened to him?" I asked. "Howard killed himself 6 months later. Couldn't live with what he'd seen, or maybe what?" Morris looked at me, his eyes hollow. "Maybe it didn't let him live with it." We sat in silence for a long moment. "So you believe me," I said finally, "about what I saw." "I didn't say that," Morris replied carefully. "I'm just telling you that strange things happen in those woods sometimes. Things we can't explain, and sometimes it's better not to try." He stood up, indicating our conversation was over. "Take the 2 weeks, Mike. Get some rest. Try to put it behind you." As I reached the door, he added, "And maybe stay out of the woods for a while." I nodded, understanding the warning for what it was. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and jumpy days. I kept seeing movement from the corner of my eye, shapes that vanished when I turned to look at them. The cut on my cheek healed, but was replaced by others. Small scratches that would appear on my arms or neck after particularly vivid nightmares. I began to research similar incidents, not just in Sutton Creek, but in forests across the country. There were patterns, if you knew what to look for. Missing hikers and campers. Lone survivors with wild stories that were quickly dismissed. Animals found dead and arranged in unnatural positions. It was happening everywhere, not just here. How had I never noticed before? On my last day of leave, I drove out to the edge of Sutton Creek Forest and parked. I didn't get out of the car, just sat there looking at the trees swaying gently in the breeze. They looked so ordinary, so harmless. Would anyone believe the horror that lurked within them? As I sat there, a park ranger pulled up beside me. I recognized him, Glenn Roberts, an older man who'd worked these woods for decades. "Deputy Reynolds," he said, nodding to me through the open window. "Heard about what happened. Nasty business." "Yeah," I agreed. "Nasty." He looked toward the forest, his expression unreadable. "You know, these woods have been here a long time. Longer than this town, longer than any of us. They've got their own rules, their own inhabitants." I turned to look at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Glenn shrugged. "Just that not everything in there answers to our laws. Not everything in there is what we'd call natural." "You've seen it," I said, not a question, but a statement. The ranger was silent for a long moment. "I've worked these woods for 38 years, he said finally. "I've learned when to look and when to turn away, when to ask questions and when to accept that some things don't have answers we'd understand." He tapped the roof of my car. "You take care, deputy, and remember, the forest watches back." Before I could respond, he was in his truck and pulling away, leaving me with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. I returned to work the next day, determined to put the incident behind me. For a while, it seemed to work. The routine of small-town policing kept me busy, and the nightmares gradually became less frequent. The mysterious scratches stopped appearing. Life began to feel normal again, until late August when another group of hikers went missing in Sutton Creek Forest. This time, Sheriff Morris didn't send me to investigate. He took the call himself, assembling a search party that conspicuously excluded me. I told myself I was relieved, that I never wanted to set foot in those woods again. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the distant sound of cicadas through my open window, I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to go back to the forest, to the rock formation, to see if the passage had reappeared. I resisted it, of course. I wasn't stupid. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger each day, like an itch I couldn't scratch. A week after the hikers disappeared, their bodies were found. All 4 of them, arranged in a clearing not far from the trail. The official cause of death was listed as an animal attack, but the details were kept from the public. Sheriff Morris returned from the scene white-faced and silent, locking himself in his office with a bottle of whiskey. That night, the pull became irresistible. I found myself driving to the forest in the middle of the night, like a sleepwalker, only half aware of my actions. I parked at the trailhead and set out on foot, guided by moonlight and memory. The forest was different at night. The darkness between the trees seemed solid, tangible. The moon cast strange shadows that moved when they shouldn't. And the silence, it was absolute, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. I reached the rock formation faster than I expected, as if the forest had somehow compressed itself, bringing my destination closer. The crevice I'd entered before was visible in the moonlight, a darker shadow against the rock face. I stood before it, fighting the compulsion to enter, to descend, to see what waited below. I knew with bone-deep certainty that if I went in there again, I wouldn't come out. "No," I said aloud, my voice startlingly loud in the silence. "I'm not going in there." A sound behind me, a twig snapping. I whirled, drawing my gun. Nothing was there, just trees and shadows. But I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. "I know you're there," I called out. "I know what you are." No response but the weight of that unseen gaze. "I'm not afraid of you," I lied. A soft sound then, almost like laughter, but not quite right. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, a dry rustling like dead leaves in the wind. And suddenly, it was there, standing at the edge of the small clearing, half hidden by shadows, but unmistakable. The creature from the chamber, its 2 long limbs, its wrong proportions, its almost human face with those terrible knowing eyes. We stared at each other across the clearing, neither moving. I kept my gun trained on it, though I knew bullets had little effect. "What are you?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. It tilted its head, that curious, dog-like motion that was somehow more disturbing than anything else about it. "Older," it said, its voice the same raspy whisper from my dreams, seeming to form directly in my mind rather than coming from its misshapen mouth. "Older than your kind? Older than these trees?" I hadn't really expected an answer, and the shock of receiving one nearly made me lower my gun. The creature took a step forward, and I quickly raised it again. "Stay back," I warned. It stopped, but not out of fear. Its eyes held a kind of amused tolerance, like an adult humoring a child's game. "Why are you killing people?" I asked, desperate to understand. Another head tilt. "Killing?" it repeated as if the concept was unfamiliar. "No, studying, learning. Your kind is interesting." "Those campers," I said, my voice rising. "Jeffrey Winters. You tore him apart." "To see how he worked," the creature replied, as if this was perfectly reasonable. "To understand. Your kind does the same to smaller creatures, to plants, to the earth itself. You take apart to understand." "That's different," I protested. But even as I said it, I wondered if it was true. How many animals had humans dissected in the name of science? How many forests had we torn down to see what we could build in their place? The creature seemed to sense my doubt. "Not so different," it said. "Only a matter of perspective, of place in the order of things." It took another step forward, and this time I didn't raise my gun. Something about its words had frozen me in place, forcing me to confront an uncomfortable truth. That perhaps to this ancient thing, humans were just another species to be studied and understood, our pain no more significant than that of a lab rat. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Nothing," it said. "You saw. Most who see do not live. But you are different. You understand a little. You feel the pull of older things, older ways." As it spoke, I became aware of a strange sensation spreading through my body. A tingling that started in my fingertips and worked its way up my arms, across my chest, down to my toes. It wasn't painful, but it wasn't pleasant either. It felt like change, like transformation. With a shock of horror, I realized what was happening. It was changing me, making me like it. "No!" I shouted, stumbling backward. "Stop it!" The creature watched impassively. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it said. "You have been marked since you entered my domain, since you looked into my eyes and knew me." The tingling intensified, becoming a burning sensation that raced along my nerves. I fell to my knees, dropping my gun, clutching at my chest where my heart hammered painfully against my ribs. "I don't want this," I gasped. "Want does not enter into it," the creature replied. "It is already done. You will change. You will understand. You will become." The burning reached my face, concentrated on my cheeks where the mysterious scratches had appeared and healed over the past weeks. I realized now what they had been, markers of the gradual transformation, the creature slowly remaking me in its image. But as I knelt there, feeling my body betraying me, something unexpected happened. The burning began to recede. The tingling faded. My racing heart slowed to its normal rhythm. I looked up at the creature, confused. Its expression was also one of surprise, as much as its inhuman features could convey such an emotion. "Interesting," it said after a long moment. "You resist. Few do." I struggled to my feet, retrieving my gun. "I'm not becoming like you," I said firmly. "I reject it." The creature studied me with those ancient eyes. "For now," it conceded, "but the mark remains. The potential. You will carry it with you, Deputy Reynolds. Always." It stepped back into the shadows, its form becoming indistinct, blending with the darkness between the trees. "We will meet again," it said, its voice already fading, becoming part of the rustling leaves and the night wind. "When you are ready, when you understand." And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the clearing, shaken but unchanged, at least outwardly. I made my way back to my car on unsteady legs, half expecting to be attacked at any moment. But nothing disturbed my journey except the gradual return of normal forest sounds, crickets chirping, an owl hooting in the distance, as if the creature's departure had released the woods from their unnatural silence. As I drove away from Sutton Creek Forest, I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, that what I had encountered was real, not a hallucination or a product of trauma. And second, that I would indeed see it again someday, whether I wanted to or not. The mark it spoke of wasn't visible, but I could feel it nonetheless. A subtle awareness in the back of my mind, a connection to something ancient and other. It wasn't actively trying to change me anymore, but the potential remained, dormant but present. A seed planted in fertile soil, waiting for the right conditions to grow. I wondered how many others carried similar marks, how many had encountered the creature or others like it in forests across the world. How many had resisted, and how many had succumbed, changing gradually until they too became something not quite human, something that studied and learned and took apart to understand. The thought should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange calm. I had faced the impossible and survived. I had looked into the eyes of something beyond human understanding and walked away intact. Whatever happened now, I would face it with the same determination. As I reached the outskirts of Sutton Creek, the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. A new day, a new beginning. But the shadows of the night remained with me, as I knew they always would. The weeks following my second encounter with the creature passed in a strange, dreamlike haze. I went through the motions of normal life, patrolling the streets of Sutton Creek, filling out paperwork, eating meals I couldn't taste, sleeping in brief, restless bursts. But a part of me remained in that forest clearing, locked in silent communion with something ancient and other. Sheriff Morris watched me with concerned eyes, but asked no questions. Perhaps he recognized the signs, had seen them before in others, who had glimpsed what lurked in the deep woods. Or perhaps he simply attributed my distraction to the trauma of finding Jeffrey Winter's body. Either way, he kept me on light duty, assigned to tasks that wouldn't tax my clearly fragmented attention. It was during this period that I began to notice changes. Nothing dramatic or visible. I wasn't growing extra limbs or developing inhuman eyes, but subtle shifts in perception and awareness. Sounds became sharper, more distinct. Scents carried information they hadn't before. I could smell fear on suspects, illness on victims, deceit on witnesses. At night, my vision adapted more quickly to darkness, allowing me to see details that should have been invisible. I told myself these were normal heightenings of sense, the result of trauma making me more alert, more aware of my surroundings. But deep down, I knew better. The mark the creature had left on me was expressing itself in these small ways, changing me not into something like it, but into something between, no longer fully human, not yet other. The dreams were the worst part. Night after night, I found myself back in that underground chamber, watching as the creature systematically dismantled human bodies, not with malice, but with the detached curiosity of a scientist. And in the dreams, I understood. I saw the purpose behind the horror, the knowledge being gained through these terrible acts. I woke from these nightmares not screaming, but contemplative, my mind filled with insights I didn't want and couldn't share. One morning in late September, I awoke from such a dream to find Sheriff Morris sitting in the chair beside my bed. I startled, reaching instinctively for my gun before recognizing him. "Easy, Mike," he said, raising his hands. "It's just me." I sat up, rubbing my eyes. "How did you get in? You gave me a key, remember? After that business with the break-in at your place last year?" He studied my face. "You were talking in your sleep, saying things that didn't make sense." A chill ran through me. "What things?" Morris hesitated. "Words that weren't English, sounds I've never heard before." His weathered face creased with concern. "Mike, what happened out there in those woods? What really happened?" For a moment, I considered telling him everything. The creature, its words, the mark it had left on me. But something held me back. A certainty that sharing this burden wouldn't lighten it, would only place it on another's shoulders as well. "I told you what happened," I said instead. "Animal attack. Jeffrey died. The others were never found." Morris nodded slowly, clearly not believing me but unwilling to push further. "All right, if that's how you want to play it." He stood up. "But I'm here if you need to talk. About anything." After he left, I got up and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. Physically, I appeared unchanged. Same brown hair, same blue eyes, same features I'd had my entire life. But there was something different in my expression, a knowing look that hadn't been there before, the look of someone who had seen behind the curtain of reality and couldn't unsee it. I touched my face, half expecting to feel alterations beneath the skin, but there was only normal flesh and bone. Whatever changes were occurring, they were more subtle than physical transformation. They were changes of perception, of understanding, and that, in its way, was more frightening. That day at the station, a call came in that changed everything. A hiker had found human remains in Sutton Creek Forest, not far from where the second group of missing people had been discovered. But these weren't fresh remains. According to the hiker, they appeared to be skeletal, possibly years old. Sheriff Morris took the call himself, but this time he asked me to accompany him. "I want you with me on this one, Mike," he said, his expression unreadable. "I think you need to see this." I didn't argue, though the thought of returning to those woods sent ice through my veins. We drove in silence, the patrol car bumping along the unpaved road leading to the trailhead. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform gray that threatened rain but withheld it, creating a diffuse, shadowless light that made the forest look flat and unreal. The hiker met us at the trailhead, a nervous young man who kept glancing back toward the trees as if expecting something to emerge from them. He led us about a mile into the forest, to a small clearing where the ground had recently been disturbed, not by human activity, but by heavy rains that had washed away topsoil, revealing what lay beneath. Bones. Human bones, partially unearthed, bleached white by time and exposure. But they weren't arranged as they would be in a normal grave, or even as they would fall in a natural death. They had been positioned deliberately, laid out in a pattern that made no sense at first glance, but suggested purpose, intent. "Jesus," Morris muttered, kneeling beside the exposed remains. "How long have these been here?" I didn't answer, my attention caught by the pattern. From my standing position, I could see something the sheriff closer to the ground could not. The bones formed a symbol, a complex glyph etched into the earth with human remains as its medium. And I recognized it. I had seen it before in my dreams. It was one of the symbols carved into the walls of that underground chamber, one of the marks the creature used to record its observations, its learnings about human physiology and psychology. "Mike?" Morris was looking up at me, his expression concerned. "You okay? You've gone white as a sheet." I forced myself to nod to appear normal. "Fine, just surprised by the find." The sheriff turned back to the bones. "We need to get the medical examiner out here, get these remains identified. Could be connected to those hikers who went missing back in '98. Remember that case? Never did find the bodies." I was only half listening, my attention still fixed on the symbol. In my mind's eye, I could see it glowing, pulsing with a meaning I almost but not quite understood. And beneath that visual overlay, I noticed something else, more disturbed earth, suggesting that the pattern continued beyond what was currently visible. This wasn't an isolated finding. It was part of something larger. "Sheriff," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears, "I think there's more." Morris looked where I was pointing. "More bones? More remains. The pattern continues." I gestured to indicate the shape I perceived. "We should check over there." The sheriff gave me an odd look but followed my direction. Sure enough, more bones were found just beneath the surface where I had indicated. And beyond those, more still, forming a complex arrangement that spread throughout the clearing. By the time the medical examiner arrived, we had uncovered enough to know we were dealing with multiple sets of remains, possibly as many as a dozen individuals, all arranged in this elaborate pattern that seemed to radiate outward from a central point. Dr. Simmons, the county ME, was visibly disturbed by what she found. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted, carefully examining a skull that had been positioned at one of the pattern's nodes. These remains spanned different time periods. Some might be decades old, others more recent. "How can you tell?" Morris asked. "Weathering patterns, bone density." She pointed to different sets of remains. "These over here are much older than these, and these, I'd say only a few years in the ground." "A serial killer," Morris said grimly. "Someone's been at this for a long time." But I knew better. This wasn't the work of a human killer, no matter how deranged. This was something else entirely. A record, a document, a way of storing information that used human remains as its medium. The creature had been studying us for decades, perhaps centuries, and this was its library, its archive of knowledge gained through horrific experimentation. I said nothing, of course. How could I explain what I somehow knew, what had been transmitted to me through dreams and that brief connection in the forest clearing? Instead, I helped process the scene, photographing and documenting each gruesome discovery with a detachment that worried me even as I maintained it. The investigation that followed consumed the department for weeks. The remains were carefully excavated, cataloged, and sent to the state crime lab for identification. Some were matched to missing persons cases dating back to the 1970s. Others remained unidentified, their stories lost to time and the creature's insatiable curiosity. Sheriff Morris became obsessed with the case, convinced we were dealing with a human killer of unprecedented longevity and calculation. He developed theories about cult activity, multi-generational family involvement, copycat killers continuing a tradition begun decades ago. Anything to avoid the conclusion that something inhuman was responsible. I let him believe what he needed to believe. Sometimes the truth is too heavy a burden to share. As the investigation progressed, my dreams intensified. Night after night, I found myself back in that underground chamber. But now, I wasn't merely an observer. I was a participant, watching my own hands dismantling human bodies with the same detached curiosity I had seen in the creature. And worse, I understood. I saw the patterns, the connections, the knowledge being assembled piece by bloody piece. I began to avoid sleep, staying awake for days at a time until exhaustion claimed me. But even then, the dreams came, more vivid than ever. I started to fear that one day I would wake to find blood on my hands, to discover that what I thought were dreams had become reality. It was during this period of sleep-deprived paranoia that I received an unexpected visitor. I was at home attempting to distract myself with mindless television when there was a knock at my door. Opening it, I found Glenn Roberts, the park ranger I had spoken with months earlier. "Deputy Reynolds," he said, his expression grave. "May I come in? We need to talk." I let him in, my instincts telling me this wasn't a social call. Glenn settled into my couch, declining my offer of coffee or something stronger. He looked older than when I had last seen him, the lines in his face deeper, his eyes shadowed with something that might have been fear. "I heard about what you found in the forest," he said without preamble. "The bones, the pattern." I nodded, saying nothing. "This isn't the first time something like this has been discovered in these woods," Glenn continued. "Back in '84, a similar site was found, and before that in '67. Each time it was covered up. Each time, people convinced themselves it was the work of humans, because the alternative was unthinkable." I felt a chill run through me. What alternative? Glenn's eyes met mine, and I saw in them the knowledge I had been carrying alone for months. "You know what?" he said softly. "You've seen it." The relief of finding someone who understood, who believed, was overwhelming. I sank into a chair across from him, suddenly exhausted. "Yes," I admitted, "I've seen it." "And it's marked you," Glenn said, not a question but a statement. "I can see it in your eyes, the knowing look, the way you move, like you're listening to something no one else can hear." I nodded again, unable to speak. "There are others," the ranger continued. "Not many, but some. People who have encountered it and survived, who carry its mark but haven't succumbed to it. We find each other eventually." "What is it?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months finally finding voice. "Where did it come from?" Glenn shook his head. "Those are questions without answers, at least none that would make sense to us. It's old, older than human civilization. It learns, it studies, it observes. It's been watching us evolve from the beginning, documenting our development with the same clinical detachment a scientist might show to bacteria in a petri dish." "But why?" I pressed. "Why the killing, the dissection? What purpose does it serve?" "Knowledge," Glenn said simply. "Pure knowledge, without moral framework or ethical constraints. It wants to understand us completely, inside and out, physically and psychologically. Our bodies, our minds, our souls, if such things exist. And it's patient. It thinks in terms of centuries, millennia. Individual human lives mean nothing to it." I thought of the bones arranged in that cryptic pattern, decades of killing documented in a language only the creature could fully comprehend. "And we're just letting this happen. No one stops it." Glenn's laugh was bitter. "How do you stop something that was here before we were? Something that doesn't think or feel as we do. Something that can bend reality around itself, make passages appear and disappear, alter memories and perceptions?" He leaned forward. "Those who know of it have tried. Some have died trying. Others have changed, become something neither human nor other, but something in between. Like what I was becoming, I thought, but didn't say." "So what do we do?" I asked instead. "We watch," Glenn replied. "We document. We try to understand it even as it tries to understand us. And most importantly, we protect others from the knowledge we carry." He held my gaze. "Because once you know, truly know, there's no going back. The mark never leaves you." We talked long into the night, Glenn sharing what little he knew about the creature and others like it that existed in remote corners of the world. He introduced me to terms and concepts I had never encountered before, ways of thinking about reality that challenged everything I had been taught. And when he left in the early hours of the morning, he gave me a small, leather-bound book. "A journal," he explained. "Record what you experience, what you learn. Someday, it may help others who bear the mark." The journal became my lifeline in the weeks that followed. I documented my dreams, my changing perceptions, the subtle shifts in my understanding of the world. Writing it down somehow made it more manageable, turned the formless terror into something I could examine and analyze. The investigation into the bone pattern eventually stalled, as I had known it would. Without a suspect, without a clear motive, law enforcement can only do so much. The case remained open, but inactive, the files gathering dust on a shelf in the records room. Sheriff Morris never fully recovered from the case. He retired 6 months later, aged beyond his years, his once sharp mind dulled by the impossibility of what he had encountered. I attended his retirement party, watched him shake hands and accept good wishes with a fixed smile that never reached his eyes. And when we had a moment alone, he pulled me aside. "I know you know more than you're saying, Mike," he said, his voice low and urgent. "About those bones, about what's really going on in those woods." I started to deny it, but he waved my protestations away. "I don't want to know," he continued. "I really don't. But I need to ask you one thing." He gripped my arm tightly. "Is it over? Whatever it is it done?" I looked into his eyes, saw the desperate need for reassurance, for some kind of closure, and I lied. "Yes," I said. "It's over." The relief that washed over his features was painful to witness. He nodded, patted my shoulder, and rejoined the party, his burden seemingly lightened. But it wasn't over. It would never be over. The creature continued its work, its studies, its meticulous documentation of human existence. And I continued to feel its presence, to understand more of its purpose through dreams and flashes of insight I neither wanted nor could fully comprehend. I stayed in Sutton Creek, taking over as sheriff when Morris retired. Some might wonder why I remained so close to the source of my trauma, why I didn't flee to some city far from those haunted woods. The answer is simple. Where else could I go? The mark was on me, inside me. Distance wouldn't diminish it, and at least here I could watch, could perhaps prevent others from suffering as Jeffrey Winters and countless unnamed victims had suffered. Glenn introduced me to others who bore the mark, a retired professor in Maine who had encountered something similar in the woods near Bangor, a Forest Service employee in Oregon with the same knowing look in her eyes, a librarian in New Mexico who documented encounters with something ancient and other in the desert caves near her home. We formed a loose network, sharing information, supporting each other through the nightmares and the gradual changes. Some of us changed more than others. Some embraced the transformation, seeking to understand what they were becoming. Others, like me, resisted, clinging to our humanity with stubborn determination. Years passed. The dreams never stopped, but they became less frequent, less vivid. The changes stabilized, leaving me human in appearance and largely human in thought, but with perceptions and awareness no ordinary person possessed. I learned to use these abilities in my work, to sense danger before it manifested, to know when someone was lying, not through training, but through some indefinable sense that transcended normal human capacity. I never returned to the rock formation, never sought out the creature again. But I felt its presence sometimes, at the edges of my awareness, watching, waiting. And occasionally, when a hiker went missing or a camper failed to return, I would know. I would feel it hunting, studying, learning, and there was nothing I could do but document another loss, another data point in its endless research. In 2013, 10 years after my first encounter, I received a call from Glenn Roberts. His voice was weak, strained. "It's time, Mike," he said. "I'm changing, really changing, not like before." I drove to his cabin at the edge of the forest that same day. What I found there defies description. Glenn was still recognizably himself, but his body had begun to transform in ways that no human body should. His limbs had elongated, joints bending at unnatural angles. His skin had developed patches of texture that resembled the creature's leathery hide. "It happens eventually," he told me, his voice a painful rasp. "To some of us. The mark expresses itself fully. The change completes." I sat with him through the night, holding his hand as he transformed, as his humanity slipped away bit by bit. By dawn, what lay on the bed was no longer Glenn Roberts. But it wasn't quite the creature either. It was something between, something neither human nor other, but a bridge between worlds. The thing that had been Glenn looked at me with eyes that still held a spark of human consciousness. "Don't fear this," it said, its voice a dry whisper that formed in my mind rather than my ears. "It's not an ending. It's an evolution." Then it was gone, slipping out the door with a grace that belied its twisted form, disappearing into the forest to join the ancient thing that had marked us both. I burned Glenn's cabin that day, erasing all evidence of what had occurred there. His disappearance became another unsolved case, another mystery that Sutton Creek added to its long history of inexplicable events. And I returned to my life, to my work, to my endless vigilance. The journal Glenn had given me filled up, and I started another, then another, documenting not just my own experiences but those of others who bore the mark, creating a record of human encounters with the unknowable. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of night, I wonder what will become of me. Will I one day complete the change as Glenn did, losing my humanity entirely? Or will I remain in this liminal state, neither fully human nor fully other, aware of both worlds but belonging to neither? The creature offered no answers when we met in that forest clearing. Perhaps there are none to be had. Perhaps we are all just subjects in its grand experiment, our lives and deaths nothing more than data points in a study that spans millennia. But I continue to resist, to cling to the humanity that remains within me. And I watch the woods, always watch, documenting each disappearance, each strange occurrence, building a record that may someday help others understand what lurks in the shadows beyond the edge of civilization. Because knowledge, even terrible knowledge, is better than ignorance. Even when that knowledge changes you forever. Even when it marks you as something no longer fully human. The nighttime still finds me often at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness between the trees, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon me. And behind me the lights of Sutton Creek shine like small beacons of normalcy, in a world that has never been what we thought it was. A world where ancient things study us with cold curiosity, and where some of us bear their mark, walking the boundary between what we were and what we might become. I've been working as a cop for close to 7 years now, which is weird, considering I didn't even think I'd make it through 6 months of the academy. It wasn't really my dream job, but the rent in Coram, Montana wasn't going to pay itself, and I wasn't exactly loaded with other skills. I grew up on a ranch not far from here, surrounded by horses and mountains. But that's the kind of life you want to escape when you're young and dumb. Now I wouldn't trade those endless open skies for anything. My name's Grady McLean, and this particular shift in 1998 is one I still can't explain. Coram's a tiny town, a blip on the map with just a few streets, a diner and a post office. You might pass through on your way to Glacier National Park, but you'd blink and miss it if you weren't looking for it. Being a cop in a place like this, it's a lot more boredom than action. Most days you're either shooing away drunk tourists or giving directions to people who got lost on their way to the park. But when things go bad here, they go real bad. Maybe it's the isolation, the wildness of the place, or just the fact that help is never coming fast enough. That October night started like any other. The temperature had dropped early that year, and the mountains were already showing signs of the coming winter. Patches of early snow dotted the higher elevations, and the wind carried that sharp bite that makes your lungs ache if you breathe too deep. I'd been on duty since 4 in the afternoon, and the most exciting thing I'd done was help old Mrs. Wilson get her cat out of a tree. The sky had that deep blue-black look it gets out here when there's no city lights to pollute it, and the stars were coming out like diamonds scattered across velvet. Sheriff Davenport had gone home early with a head cold, leaving me as the only law enforcement on duty for the next 20 miles. Not that it mattered much. After tourist season ended, Coram became a ghost town. Most of the seasonal businesses had already closed up, leaving just the year-rounders, a mix of hardy locals, a few rich folks with vacation homes, and those strange souls who preferred the isolation. I was parked outside Ruby's diner, nursing a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Ruby herself had left me a piece of apple pie on the house before closing up. "You look like you could use some sugar," she'd said, patting my shoulder with hands that had been serving food to folks in this town since before I was born. The radio crackled occasionally with updates from dispatch over in Columbia Falls, but it was mostly dead air. I was thinking about calling it an early night, maybe stopping by the Antler Bar for a quick drink before heading home to my empty apartment, when the call came in. "Unit 4, come in. This is dispatch." I picked up the receiver, suppressing a yawn. "This is Unit 4. Go ahead, dispatch." "We've got a report of unusual activity up near Eagle Ridge Trail. 2 hikers reported missing, and locals saw strange lights in the foothills. Probably nothing, but Ranger Stevens asked if you could check it out. I straightened up in my seat. Missing hikers weren't uncommon, especially this time of year when unprepared tourists underestimated how quickly the weather could turn. But strange lights? That was new. Copy that. What kind of lights are we talking about? There was a pause on the other end. Caller wasn't specific, just said they were unnatural, whatever that means. Probably some kids with flashlights. Roger that. I'll head up that way now. Any details on the missing hikers? A man and woman, mid-20s to early 30s, driving a blue Honda Civic with Illinois plates. They were supposed to return to their lodging by sunset. Owner called it in when they didn't show. Names? Wilson Reed and Amanda Blake. First time in the park, according to the lodge owner. I jotted down the names on my notepad. All right, I'm on my way. Keep me posted if anything else comes in. Will do. Be careful up there, Grady. Weather report says it might snow tonight. I hung up the receiver and started the cruiser. The engine rumbled to life, the heater slowly pushing warm air into the cab. I checked my watch, 10:17 p.m. If those hikers were still out there, they'd be getting mighty cold by now. Before heading up to the trail, I swung by the station to grab my heavy-duty flashlight, first aid kit, and the emergency pack we kept for search and rescue operations. The station was empty and dark, with just the security lights casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. My footsteps echoed as I collected my gear. The gun on my hip felt suddenly heavier as I loaded up. Not that I expected to need it. Bears were mostly denning by now, and the mountain lions rarely bothered humans. But something about the call had set me on edge. Strange lights, unnatural. Those words kept repeating in my head. Back in the cruiser, I plotted my route. Eagle Ridge Trail was about 20 minutes out of town, a moderately difficult hike that offered spectacular views of the valley. It was popular during the day but closed at sunset for safety reasons. What those hikers were doing up there after dark was beyond me. The road out of town was deserted. As the last streetlight faded in my rearview mirror, darkness closed in around me like a living thing. The headlights carved a tunnel through the night, revealing glimpses of the dense forest on either side of the road. Occasionally, a pair of reflective eyes would shine from the underbrush, deer probably, or maybe a fox. The pavement gave way to gravel as I turned onto the Forest Service road that led to the trailhead. The cruiser bounced and rattled, shaking my teeth as I navigated the rutted path. I'd driven this road 100 times before, but tonight it felt different, longer, darker. 10 minutes in, the radio started acting up, the dispatcher's voice breaking into fragments between bursts of static. Unit 4, signal, repeat. I picked up the receiver. Dispatch, you're breaking up. Say again. More static, then. Back to station. Immediately. The radio went dead. Just static, hissing like angry snakes. I tried to raise dispatch again, but there was nothing. Not even static now. Complete silence. Great. Radio dead zones weren't uncommon in these mountains, but the timing couldn't have been worse. I considered turning back, but I was already more than halfway to the trailhead. Those hikers, if they were still out there, might need help urgently. I pressed on, the forest growing thicker around me. The trees seemed to lean in toward the road, their branches reaching like gnarled fingers across the path. An owl swooped low across my headlights, startling me. As I rounded the final bend, the trailhead parking area came into view. It was a small clearing, just big enough for maybe a dozen cars. Tonight there was only one, a blue Honda Civic with Illinois plates. Bingo. I pulled up next to it, cutting the engine but leaving the headlights on to illuminate the area. The silence was immediate and oppressive after the constant rumble of the cruiser's engine. Out here, this far from town, the quiet had a weight to it, a presence. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, and approached the Honda. It was locked, with no signs of forced entry or struggle. A quick peek through the windows revealed a typical tourist setup: maps, water bottles, granola bar wrappers, and a pair of cheap binoculars on the passenger seat. The temperature had dropped further, and my breath fogged in front of my face. I zipped my jacket higher and turned toward the trailhead, where a wooden sign marked the beginning of Eagle Ridge Trail. Beyond it, the path disappeared into darkness. And that's when I noticed something odd. The air around the trailhead seemed different, thicker somehow, like the boundary between the parking area and the trail was more than just physical. A strange stillness hung there, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As I stood staring into that absolute darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced since I was a child, a primal, nameless fear of what might be lurking just beyond the light. Not the rational caution of an experienced cop, but the instinctive terror of a prey animal sensing a predator. For a split second, I considered getting back in my cruiser and driving away, but duty and concern for those missing hikers pushed me forward. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam seeming pathetically inadequate against the wall of darkness, and stepped onto the trail. I had no way of knowing that I was walking into a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The trail started innocently enough, a well-maintained path of packed dirt winding through towering pines. My flashlight beam bounced along ahead of me, casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. The usual night sounds surrounded me, the rustle of wind through needles, the occasional snap of a twig, as some nocturnal creature went about its business, the distant hoot of an owl. But something was off. It took me nearly 5 minutes of hiking to realize what it was. There was a rhythm to the forest sounds, almost like a pattern. The rustling, the cracking branches, the calls of night birds. They were happening at regular intervals, as if on a loop. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Wilson, Amanda," I called out, my voice sounding small and swallowed by the vastness around me. No response came back, not even an echo. I kept walking, stopping occasionally to listen or examine the path for signs of recent passage. The trail was well used, making it difficult to distinguish fresh footprints from old ones. But about half a mile in, I found something promising. A small piece of bright blue fabric caught on a thorny bush. It matched the color of the windbreaker visible on the passenger seat of the Honda. Good. At least I was on the right track. I continued upward, the trail becoming steeper and more rugged. Eagle Ridge was known for its challenging final ascent, a series of switchbacks that climbed almost vertically up the mountainside before opening onto spectacular views of the valley below. During the day, it was breathtaking. At night, with only a flashlight to guide me, it was treacherous. The moon had risen over the peaks, casting a silvery glow that did little to illuminate the path, but transformed the surrounding forest into a landscape of ghostly shapes and deep shadows. The temperature had dropped further, and the ground was starting to frost over, making each step a potential slip. That's when I heard it for the first time. The scraping sound, low and rhythmic, like stone being dragged across stone. It echoed through the trees from somewhere up ahead. I froze, listening intently. It wasn't an animal sound, at least not one I recognized, and I'd spent my entire life in these mountains. It wasn't mechanical either, too irregular, too deliberate. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. "Forest Service, anyone up there?" The scraping stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. Then, slowly, it started again, faster now and somehow closer, though I couldn't pinpoint the direction. A rational explanation presented itself. Perhaps it was the missing hikers trying to build a shelter or signal for help. But a deeper, more instinctive part of me rejected this explanation immediately. Whatever was making that sound wasn't human. I continued up the trail, my hand resting on the butt of my service weapon. The path narrowed as it wound around a rocky outcropping, forcing me to hug the mountain wall on one side while a steep drop-off yawned on the other. My flashlight beam caught something reflective on the ground ahead, a small puddle of liquid that gleamed black in the artificial light. I knelt down, careful not to touch it. The metallic smell hit me immediately. Blood, fresh enough to still be wet in the freezing air. Rising slowly, I swept my flashlight across the ground, following a trail of similar droplets that led around the bend. The scraping sound had stopped again, but now I heard something else, a wet, slithering noise like something heavy being dragged through mud. My training kicked in. I drew my weapon and held the flashlight out to the side, away from my body, a technique designed to make me less of a target. "Police officer!" I shouted. "Identify yourself!" No response, just the continued slithering sound, moving away from me now. I followed cautiously, rounding the bend in the trail. The blood drops grew larger, forming a continuous smear that glistened in my flashlight beam. Whatever was bleeding had lost a significant amount of blood. The trail widened into a small plateau about 50 yards ahead, one of the few level areas on the otherwise steep path. As I approached, my light caught something that made me stop short. A backpack, torn open and spilling its contents across the ground. A water bottle, a map, energy bars, a small first aid kit, tourist supplies. I moved closer, scanning the area. The blood trail led directly to the backpack, then seemed to veer sharply off the trail into the dense forest. I knelt beside the pack, examining it more closely. The damage wasn't from an animal, no claw or teeth marks. It looked almost like it had been pulled apart, the seams methodically separated. Inside a side pocket, I found a wallet. The driver's license inside confirmed what I already suspected. Wilson Reed, 29, from Chicago, Illinois. One of our missing hikers. I stood up, a sense of foreboding settling over me like a physical weight. "Wilson," I called again. "Amanda, this is Officer McLean from Coram Police Department. If you can hear me, call out." The forest seemed to absorb my words, giving nothing back. But the scraping sound returned, this time from the direction where the blood trail disappeared into the trees. Common sense told me to wait for backup, to return to my vehicle and call for additional officers and search and rescue. But the blood was fresh, and if Wilson or Amanda was injured, every minute could count. Plus, backup was at least an hour away, assuming I could even get radio contact from the trailhead. I made a decision I would later question 1,000 times. I stepped off the trail, following the blood smears into the forest. The underbrush was thick here, untouched by the trail maintenance crews who kept the main path clear. Branches snagged at my uniform, and hidden roots threatened to trip me with every step. The blood trail remained clear, though, too clear, as if whatever was bleeding wanted to be followed. I'd gone perhaps 50 yards when the forest suddenly opened into a small clearing. My flashlight beam swept across the open space, revealing nothing at first. Then I aimed it upward, and the breath caught in my throat. The trees surrounding the clearing were decorated, that's the only word for it, with strips of cloth, shreds of what looked like a blue windbreaker, and pieces of hiking boots hung from branches like grotesque ornaments. They twisted slightly in the night breeze, creating a soft rustling that had been masking another sound until I stopped moving. Breathing. Ragged, wet breathing, coming from the far side of the clearing. I swung my flashlight in that direction, and for a moment, I thought I saw something retreat into the shadows, something large and hunched, moving with an unnatural, fluid grace. But it was gone before I could focus on it, leaving me wondering if my eyes had played tricks on me. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. "Is someone there? I'm a police officer." The breathing continued, now punctuated by a soft, rhythmic tapping sound. I moved forward cautiously, weapon still drawn, using the trees at the edge of the clearing for cover. As I approached the source of the sounds, the beam of my flashlight finally revealed something solid, a human figure, propped against the base of a massive pine tree. Relief flooded through me for a split second, until I got close enough to see details. It was a woman, Amanda Blake, I presumed, but she was in bad shape. Her hiking clothes were torn and bloody, one leg bent at an impossible angle. Her face was pale as the moon above, eyes wide and staring. But what chilled me most was the rhythmic movement of her right hand, tapping against the trunk of the tree. Not randomly, but in a deliberate pattern. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. "Ma'am?" I holstered my weapon and crouched beside her, medical training taking over. "Amanda, can you hear me? I'm Officer McLean. I'm here to help you." Her eyes flickered toward me, recognition, or at least awareness, dawning in them. Her lips moved, forming words with no sound. I leaned closer. "What happened? Where's Wilson?" She managed to whisper so faint I nearly missed it. "It took him up. It took him up." "What took him?" I asked, already checking her for injuries. The broken leg was obvious, but I couldn't immediately find the source of all the blood. Her eyes widened, staring past me into the darkness of the forest. Her tapping stopped. "It's watching," she breathed. "Right now, behind you." Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to face whatever threat might be there, but I forced myself to stay focused on Amanda. Quick movements could trigger an attack from a predator, and despite my growing certainty that we weren't dealing with an ordinary animal, old habits died hard. "I need to get you out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Can you tell me what happened? What attacked you?" "Not attacked," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the point behind me. "Hunted." A sound came from behind me then, the same scraping noise I'd been hearing, but much closer now. Deliberate, almost like communication. Slowly, I turned my head, keeping one hand on Amanda's shoulder. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush, but I could feel it, a presence, watching, assessing. The weight of its attention was almost physical. "We need to move," I said, turning back to Amanda. "I'm going to try to splint your leg, then carry you back to the trail. It's going to hurt." She grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "No, you don't understand. It wants you to try. It's playing." "Playing?" The word sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold night air. "Wilson thought it was lights from another hiker," she continued, her voice growing fainter. "Beautiful lights, like nothing I've ever seen. We followed them, off the trail. Stupid." I looked around for anything I could use as a splint for her leg. "Just stay with me. We're going to get out of here." "No," she whispered. "We're not." The scraping sound came again, louder and more insistent. Then another sound joined it, a wet, tearing noise that set my teeth on edge. Amanda's eyes fixed on something over my shoulder, and the little color remaining in her face drained away. "It's here," she breathed. This time when I turned, my flashlight caught something, a brief glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. Something large and dark slipping between trees with impossible speed and grace for its size. I drew my weapon again. "Police officer," I shouted. "Show yourself." The forest went silent. Even the night birds and insects ceased their calls. The only sound was Amanda's labored breathing and the pounding of my own heart. Then the lights appeared. They weren't flashlights or lanterns or anything man-made. They were points of radiance hovering among the trees, beautiful and mesmerizing, shifting through colors I couldn't even name. They moved with purpose, forming patterns that seemed almost like writing. For a moment, I forgot everything. Amanda, the danger, my own fear, captivated by those impossible lights. They seemed to be beckoning, inviting me deeper into the forest. Amanda's grip on my arm tightened painfully, breaking the spell. "Don't look," she hissed. "That's how it starts." I tore my eyes away from the lights, focusing on her face. "What is it? What's out there?" Her eyes were growing distant, her grip weakening. "Something old," she whispered. "Something that was here long before us. It knows things, sees inside you." The tearing sound came again, closer now. I could smell something rank and sharp, like wet fur and copper, and something else I couldn't identify. Amanda's hand fell away from my arm. "Run," she said, so quietly I barely heard it. "Run now. Don't look back." I knew she was right. I needed to get help, to bring back more officers, proper equipment. But leaving her felt wrong, against everything I stood for as a police officer. "I'll come back for you," I promised, already backing toward the trail. A smile ghosted across her lips. "No," she said, "you won't." I hesitated one moment too long. Something massive moved at the edge of my vision, and when I swung my flashlight toward it, the beam caught a glimpse of wet, matted fur, of too many limbs moving in concert, of eyes that reflected the light like pools of oil. Amanda screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut off abruptly. I fired my weapon on instinct, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the clearing. In that split second of light, I saw it clearly, the thing that hunted in these woods, and I ran. I don't remember much about my retreat down the trail. Blind panic has a way of erasing details, replacing them with flashes of sensation. The burn in my lungs as I gulped the frigid air, the sting of branches whipping across my face, the jarring impact each time my boots hit the ground. I ran without looking back, driven by a primal fear that bypassed all rational thought. It wasn't until I reached the small plateau where I'd found Wilson's backpack, that reason began to reassert itself. I stopped, hands on my knees, gasping for breath. My service weapon was still clutched in my right hand, though I had no memory of holding onto it during my headlong flight. What the hell had I just seen? My mind struggled to process the glimpse I'd caught in the muzzle flash. It had been massive, that much was certain, but its shape, it didn't conform to anything I recognized. Not bear, not mountain lion, not human. The way it moved was all wrong, too fluid, too deliberate. And those lights, those beautiful, impossible lights. I forced myself to think clearly. Amanda was still up there, possibly still alive. Wilson was missing. Whatever that thing was, I had a duty to protect them. But I wasn't stupid. I needed backup, specialized equipment, maybe even wildlife experts. This was way beyond what one small-town cop could handle alone. I holstered my weapon and retrieved my flashlight, which I'd somehow managed to hold onto despite my panic. Its beam seemed feebler now, barely penetrating the darkness that pressed in from all sides. I turned back toward the trailhead, determined to reach my cruiser and call for help. That's when I noticed the silence. Not just quietness, but a complete absence of sound. No wind in the trees, no distant calls of night birds, not even the sound of my own footsteps seemed to carry beyond my immediate vicinity. It was as if the entire mountain was holding its breath, and then the scraping started again. Not from behind me this time, but ahead, between me and the trailhead, between me and escape. Cold sweat broke out across my back. I was trapped. I considered my options. I could continue down the main trail and risk encountering whatever was making that sound. Or I could try to find an alternate route down the mountain. The second option was risky. The terrain was treacherous even in daylight, with steep drops and unstable ground. In the dark, with only a flashlight to guide me, it could be suicidal. But the scraping sound was growing louder, more insistent. Something was coming up the trail toward me. I made my decision, veering off the path and into the forest, heading roughly parallel to the trail but at a safe distance. The going was much harder here. Thick underbrush tore at my uniform, hidden roots threatened to trip me, and the slope was steeper without the benefit of switchbacks. But fear is a powerful motivator, and I pushed on. After about 10 minutes of this treacherous descent, I paused to get my bearings. The trail should be somewhere to my right, but the dense forest made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. I listened carefully, but the scraping had stopped. The silence was back, heavy and oppressive. I swept my flashlight in a slow arc, looking for any landmark that might help orient me. The beam caught something reflective about 20 yards downhill. Water, perhaps a small stream. That could be useful. Most of the streams in this area flowed toward the valley, which meant following it would eventually lead me to civilization. I made my way carefully down to the water, using trees for support on the steep slope. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a stream at all, but a small, still pool, nestled in a depression between massive boulders. Its surface was perfectly smooth, reflecting the stars and moon like a black mirror. Something about the pool made me uneasy. It seemed out of place. There had been no rain recently, and most standing water at this elevation should have been at least partially frozen in these temperatures. Yet this pool was completely liquid, with no ice at its edges. I was about to turn away when my flashlight beam caught something at the pool's center, a disturbance in the water, as if something was rising from beneath. I watched, transfixed, as the surface bulged upward, forming a dome that grew higher and higher. Then it broke, and something emerged. At first I thought it was a person. The size and general shape suggested a human head and shoulders, but as it rose further, revealing more of itself, I realized how wrong I was. Its proportions were all wrong, its movements too smooth, too coordinated. It wasn't swimming so much as flowing out of the water. I stumbled backward, fumbling for my weapon. My heel caught on a root and I went down hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. The flashlight flew from my grasp, landing several feet away. Its beam illuminated the pool from an angle, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The thing from the pool was fully emerged now, standing at the water's edge. In the indirect light, I could make out a silhouette that was vaguely humanoid but distorted, as if viewed through warped glass. It seemed to be watching me, though I couldn't discern any eyes or face. Then it spoke, not in words, not exactly. It was more like impressions, forming directly in my mind, images and sensations that bypassed my ears entirely. And what it conveyed was simple: hunger. Not the straightforward hunger of a predator seeking prey, but something more complex. A hunger for fear, for the particular flavor of terror that comes from understanding what's happening to you. A connoisseur's appreciation for the nuances of human dread. I could feel it rooting around in my thoughts, examining my fears, my weaknesses. It knew I was a cop, knew I wouldn't run again and leave civilians in danger, knew I was torn between duty and survival. It found this amusing. With trembling hands, I drew my weapon and fired, once, twice, 3 times. The reports were deafening in the silent forest, the muzzle flashes momentarily illuminating the scene with stark, shadowless light. In those frozen moments, I saw the thing clearly. It was adaptable, changing. Each flash showed a different configuration of limbs, of features, as if it was trying on shapes to see which fit best. The only constants were its size, massive, at least 7 feet tall, and the wet, matted quality of its surface, which might have been fur or scales or something else entirely. My bullets had no visible effect. They either missed or passed through it without resistance. The thing made a sound then, a low, vibrating hum that resonated in my chest cavity and made my teeth ache. It was laughing. I scrambled to my feet, abandoning the flashlight, and ran. Not back up toward the trail where Amanda lay, and not down toward the trailhead that I now knew was blocked. I ran laterally across the slope, hoping to circle around whatever was hunting me. The forest seemed to close in, branches reaching like grasping hands, roots rising to trip me. The darkness was absolute now, with only occasional glimpses of moonlight breaking through the canopy to guide my way. The thing behind me made no sound as it pursued, but I could feel its presence drawing closer with each desperate stride. Then my foot came down on emptiness, and I was falling. The slope had concealed a sharp drop-off, a small cliff perhaps 10 feet high. I tumbled down it, bouncing off rocks and roots, finally landing hard on a relatively flat stretch of ground below. Pain shot through my left ankle, not broken, I thought, but definitely sprained. I lay still, fighting to remain conscious as waves of agony washed over me. Above, at the edge of the drop-off, I could see a darker shape against the night sky. The thing, watching me. It made no move to follow, simply observing. Then it retreated, melting back into the forest with that same liquid grace. I didn't understand. Why hadn't it attacked? It clearly had me at its mercy. Clutching my injured ankle, I dragged myself to the base of a large tree, using it for support as I struggled to a sitting position. The forest around me was unfamiliar. I had no idea where on the mountain I was, or which direction might lead to safety. My radio was still dead, my flashlight lost somewhere above the cliff. I still had my weapon, but it had proven useless against whatever that thing was. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and my uniform wasn't designed for prolonged exposure to these conditions. If I didn't find my way off this mountain soon, hypothermia would become a real risk. I forced myself to stand, testing my injured ankle. It bore my weight, though pain shot up my leg with each step. Using trees for support, I began moving downhill, reasoning that any descent would eventually lead to the valley floor and civilization. That's when the lights appeared again. Those beautiful, mesmerizing points of radiance hanging in the air just ahead of me. They seemed to dance, forming patterns that almost made sense, like a language I'd forgotten. I knew I shouldn't look directly at them, shouldn't follow them. Amanda had warned me. But they were so compelling, so oddly familiar, and they were leading downhill in the direction I needed to go. Maybe, I thought, they weren't part of the thing's lure. Maybe they were something else entirely, something that could help me. It was a desperate rationalization, and some part of me knew it even then. But I was injured, lost, and freezing. I needed any help I could get. I followed the lights, limping painfully but making steady progress downhill. They stayed just ahead of me, always visible but never close enough to touch. Sometimes they would pause, waiting for me to catch up before continuing. The forest began to thin, the massive pines giving way to younger, smaller trees, and eventually to scrubby underbrush. I was getting closer to the valley floor, closer to safety. Hope began to build in my chest. That hope died as I emerged from the tree line into a small moonlit clearing and saw what waited at its center. The first body was Wilson Reed. I recognized him from his driver's license photo, though there wasn't much left of his face. He was sprawled on his back, chest cavity splayed open like a grotesque flower, ribs bent outward. Something had been examining him from the inside. Near him lay a second body that I initially didn't recognize. A man in hiking clothes, similar to Wilson's, but older, perhaps in his 50s. His corpse showed similar signs of methodical disassembly, with limbs arranged at precise angles around his torso. With a chill, I realized who it must be. Another missing hiker, one who had vanished 3 weeks earlier. The search had been called off after 5 days with no leads. We'd assumed he'd fallen into a ravine or been taken by a bear. We'd been so wrong. The lights I'd been following converged above the bodies, swirling in complex patterns that made my eyes hurt to follow. From the edges of the clearing, the scraping sound began again, not from one direction now, but from all around, surrounding me. I was herded here, I realized, driven like game into a trap. Movement caught my eye, a dark shape emerging from the trees on the far side of the clearing, then another to my right, and a third behind me. 3 of them converging on the clearing from different directions. Each was similar in size and in that fluid, unnatural movement. But their shapes were distinct, as if each had settled on a different configuration of limbs and features. They were communicating, I realized. The scraping sounds, the lights. It was a language, a coordinated hunting strategy. They had been driving me toward this clearing all along. There had never been any chance of escape. My ankle gave out, and I collapsed to my knees in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the dead and the things that had killed them. My service weapon was still holstered at my side, but I didn't reach for it. What was the point? The 3 creatures stopped at the edge of the clearing, arranged in a perfect triangle around me. They weren't rushing, weren't showing the frenzied excitement of predators closing in for a kill. They were patient, deliberate. One of them, the largest, with a shape that vaguely resembled a massive wolf standing on its hind legs, took a step forward. The lights swirled more intensely, coalescing into a column that stretched from ground to sky. And within that column, I saw Amanda. Not her physical body, which I knew was still up on the mountain, but some essence of her. Her expression was peaceful now, free of the pain and terror I'd seen in her final moments. She looked directly at me, her lips moving as if speaking, though no sound reached my ears. But somehow, I understood what she was trying to tell me. Close your eyes. In that moment, I realized what these creatures were doing. Not simply killing, but collecting. Experiences, memories, fear. Harvesting something beyond the physical bodies of their victims. And they preferred their victims aware, understanding what was happening to them. The terror was part of what they sought. I closed my eyes tightly, shutting out the lights, the creatures, the clearing. I thought of home, of the ranch where I'd grown up, of horses galloping across open fields under a wide blue sky. I thought of everything pure and bright and untouched by the horrors I'd witnessed tonight. The scraping sounds grew louder, closer. I could feel the creatures approaching, could smell that strange mixture of wet fur and copper and something else unidentifiable. But I kept my eyes closed, denying them the reaction they sought. I don't know how long I knelt there, eyes shut against the darkness. Time seemed to stretch and warp, minutes extending into what felt like hours. The cold seeped into my bones, numbing the pain in my ankle, spreading through my limbs until I could barely feel them. Eventually, I became aware of a change. The scraping had stopped. The presence I'd felt surrounding me had receded. Cautiously, I opened my eyes. The clearing was empty. No bodies, no creatures, no lights. Just moonlight on frost-covered grass and the distant hooting of an owl-normal night sounds that had been absent throughout my ordeal. I struggled to my feet, disbelieving. Had I imagined it all? A hallucination brought on by cold and fear and exhaustion? No. My uniform was torn and dirty from my flight through the forest. My ankle throbbed with real pain. And there, at the center of the clearing where Wilson's body had lain, was a small pool of congealed blood, already frosting over in the cold. It had happened. All of it. But for some reason I couldn't fathom, I had been spared. I limped across the clearing, heading downhill toward where I thought the main road might be. Every shadow made me flinch. Every sound caused me to whirl around, expecting to see those fluid shapes emerging from the darkness. But nothing pursued me. After what seemed like an eternity, I spotted headlights moving along a road below, the highway that led back to Coram. I changed direction, moving as quickly as my injured ankle would allow, determined to reach that sign of civilization, before whatever hunted in these mountains changed its mind. It took me nearly an hour to reach the highway, stumbling through underbrush and across small streams, my uniform torn and muddy, my body aching from cold and exertion. When I finally emerged onto the shoulder of the road, I must have looked like hell. A wild-eyed, limping figure appearing suddenly from the darkness. The first car that approached slowed, then accelerated past me, the driver clearly spooked by my appearance. The second car, an old pickup truck driven by a local rancher named Hank Mercer, recognized me despite my disheveled state and pulled over. "Jesus, Grady," he said as I collapsed into the passenger seat. "What the hell happened to you?" I opened my mouth to explain, then closed it again. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound completely insane? "Accident," I managed finally. "Up on Eagle Ridge. Need to get back to town." Hank didn't press for details, just cranked up the heater and handed me a thermos of coffee from his lunchbox. The hot liquid burned my throat but helped clear my head a little. "Want me to take you to the clinic?" he asked, eyeing my obvious injuries. I shook my head. "Station first. Need to report. Missing hikers." Hank nodded and put the truck in gear, humming tunelessly as we drove toward Coram. The normalcy of it, the rumbling engine, the country music playing softly on the radio, Hank's calloused hands on the steering wheel, seemed surreal after what I'd experienced in the forest. 20 minutes later, we pulled up outside the Coram police station. The lights were on inside, unusual for this time of night. "Sure you don't want the clinic?" Hank asked again, as I painfully extracted myself from the passenger seat. "I'm good," I lied. "Thanks for the ride, Hank." He drove off with a wave, and I limped up the steps to the station door. My hand was on the knob when it swung open from inside, revealing Sheriff Davenport's worried face. "McLean!" he exclaimed. "Where the hell have you been? Dispatch lost contact with you hours ago." I stumbled past him into the warmth of the station, collapsing into the nearest chair. Deputy Roberts was there too, along with a man in a Forest Service uniform that I recognized as Ranger Stevens. "The hikers," I said, my voice hoarse. "Wilson Reed and Amanda Blake. They're dead." The room went quiet. Sheriff Davenport pulled up a chair across from me, his earlier anger replaced with concern. "What happened up there, Grady?" he asked quietly. I stared at my hands, which were scratched and dirty, with dried blood under the fingernails. My blood or someone else's, I wasn't sure. "I'm not entirely sure," I said carefully. "I found their car at the trailhead, followed the trail up, found signs of violence." I swallowed hard. "Found the woman. She was injured. Before I could get her out, something attacked. I fired at it, but I couldn't stop it." "What kind of animal was it?" Ranger Stevens asked, leaning forward. "Bear? Mountain lion?" I looked up at him, then at the sheriff and Deputy Roberts. Their faces showed concern, professional interest, but no fear. They hadn't seen what I'd seen. "I didn't get a good look," I lied. "It was dark. Big, though. Moved fast." Sheriff Davenport nodded slowly. "Roberts, call search and rescue. We'll head up at first light to recover the bodies and track this animal." "There's more," I said. I think I found another body. An older man. Might be that missing hiker from last month." Ranger Stevens exchanged a look with the sheriff. 3 victims? That's not typical behavior for any predator in these mountains." "Maybe it's sick," Deputy Roberts suggested. "Rabid or injured and unable to hunt normal prey." They were rationalizing, trying to fit what I'd told them into their understanding of the world. I couldn't blame them. If someone had come to me with a story about shape-shifting creatures that hunted with lights and communicated with scraping sounds, I'd have assumed they were delirious or lying. Hell, part of me still wondered if that's exactly what I was, delirious. Maybe I'd hit my head during that fall down the cliff. Maybe I was hypothermic, hallucinating as my body temperature dropped too low. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The presence in my mind, examining my fears like a gourmet sampling fine wine. "You need medical attention," Sheriff Davenport said, noticing my distant expression. "Roberts, take him over to the clinic. Get that ankle looked at, and anything else that needs attention." I didn't argue. The adrenaline was fading, leaving exhaustion and pain in its wake. I let Roberts help me up and guide me out to his cruiser. The clinic was small, just 3 exam rooms and a waiting area staffed by a single doctor and nurse during regular hours. Tonight, only Dr. Wilkins was there, roused from his home above the clinic by Roberts's call ahead. He examined me thoroughly, cleaning my various cuts and scrapes, wrapping my sprained ankle, and checking for signs of concussion or hypothermia. His movements were efficient but gentle, his questions professional. "You're lucky," he said finally, applying the last piece of tape to my ankle wrap. Sprained ankle, mild hypothermia, various contusions and lacerations, but nothing life-threatening. "I want you to stay overnight for observation, though." I nodded, too tired to argue. Roberts left after confirming I was stable, heading back to the station to help organize the search party for the morning. Dr. Wilkins gave me some pills for the pain and helped me to one of the clinic's 2 overnight beds. The medication worked quickly, and I felt myself drifting off almost immediately, the horrors of the night receding as sleep claimed me. I dreamed of lights, beautiful dancing lights that spoke in colors and shapes instead of words. They showed me things, terrible and wonderful things. Ancient forests, where creatures like the ones I'd encountered roamed freely. Civilizations rising and falling, observed by patient, hungry eyes. Hunting grounds established and maintained over centuries. Territories marked not with scent or claw marks, but with fear. And I dreamed of Amanda, her face peaceful as she floated in a column of light, her lips forming words I couldn't quite hear. I woke with a start, sunlight streaming through the small window of the clinic room. For a moment, I didn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back, the mountain, the creature, the clearing with its grisly trophies. Dr. Wilkins came in shortly after, checking my vital signs and pronouncing me fit to leave, though he advised staying off the injured ankle as much as possible for at least a week. "Sheriff Davenport asked me to tell you to take the day off," he added, helping me into the clean uniform Roberts had brought from the station. He and the search team headed up to Eagle Ridge about an hour ago. My heart sank. I wanted to warn them, to tell them what they were really walking into. But what could I say that they would believe? That monsters lurked in those woods? That the thing they were hunting wasn't an animal, but something older? Something that thought and planned and played with its food? I thanked Dr. Wilkins and limped outside, squinting in the bright morning light. Coram looked exactly as it always had. A single main street lined with modest buildings, mountains rising majestically in the background. Normal, untouched by the horrors I'd witnessed just a few miles away. I decided to head to the station. I couldn't join the search with my injured ankle, but I could monitor the radio, be ready to send help when things went wrong. The station was empty except for the dispatcher, a middle-aged woman named Betty, who'd been working the radio at Coram PD since before I was born. She looked up as I limped in, concern evident on her weathered face. "Heard you had quite a night, Grady," she said. "You all right?" "I'll live," I replied, easing myself into a chair near the dispatch desk. "Any word from the search team?" She shook her head. "They checked in when they reached the trailhead about an hour ago. Nothing since then." She handed me a mug of coffee. "They'll find those poor people and bring them home. Don't you worry." I accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks, not trusting myself to speak. Home. Amanda and Wilson would never see their homes again, and I wasn't at all confident that the search team would fare any better. Hours passed. Betty maintained radio contact with other calls, a minor fender bender at the town's only intersection. a complaint about teenagers loitering behind the general store, while I pretended to catch up on paperwork. In reality, I was straining to hear any update from the search team. Just after noon, the radio crackled to life. "Base, this is Davenport. Do you copy? Over." Betty grabbed the microphone. "This is Base. Go ahead, Sheriff. Over. We've reached the coordinates McLean provided. There's nothing here. No bodies, no signs of a struggle. We've searched the entire area. Over." My coffee mug slipped from suddenly numb fingers, shattering on the floor. Betty shot me a concerned look before responding. "Could they have been moved? By animals or something else?" Over. A long pause before Davenport's voice returned. "No drag marks, no blood trail. It's like no one was ever here. We're expanding the search. We'll report back. Over and out." Betty set down the microphone and turned to me. "You sure about what you saw last night, Grady? You were pretty banged up when they brought you in." I opened my mouth to defend myself, then closed it again. What was I going to say? That supernatural creatures had cleaned up after themselves? That they'd removed all evidence of their kills? "I know what I saw," I said finally, my voice low. "Those hikers are dead, Betty. I just don't know where the bodies are now." She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe you, Grady, but the sheriff's gonna need something more than your word, especially with your condition last night." She was right, of course. Without bodies, without evidence, my story sounded like the ravings of a man suffering from hypothermia and shock. Maybe that's all it was. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But my ankle throbbed with very real pain, and when I closed my eyes, I could still see those lights, still hear that scraping sound that seemed to form words just beyond my understanding. "I need to go back up there," I said suddenly, standing despite the pain in my ankle. Betty looked alarmed. "The hell you do? Doc Wilkins said you need to stay off that ankle. And besides, the sheriff would have my hide if I let you go chasing after whatever attacked you last night." "I'm not going to chase it," I assured her. I need to see the area in daylight. Maybe I missed something. Maybe there's evidence I didn't see in the dark." She wasn't convinced, but she knew me well enough to recognize the determination in my voice. "At least wait for the sheriff to get back," she pleaded. "Go with the team." I shook my head. "I need to do this myself, Betty, please." She sighed heavily. "You always were a stubborn one, Grady McLean. At least take a radio that works, not that piece of junk you had last night." She handed me a newer model from the equipment locker. "And you check in every 30 minutes, you hear me? Every 30 minutes or I'm sending the National Guard after you." I promised I would, collected my service weapon and a fresh flashlight from my locker, and headed out to my personal vehicle, an aging Jeep Cherokee that had seen better days but could handle the mountain roads better than most. The drive up to Eagle Ridge Trail was different in daylight. The forest that had seemed so threatening, so alien last night was just woods. Pines and aspens and the occasional meadow, all perfectly ordinary under the bright blue sky. I parked at the trailhead, noting the absence of the blue Honda Civic. The search team must have had it towed for examination. Good. Maybe they'd find something there that would support my story. The hike up the trail was slow and painful with my injured ankle. I leaned heavily on a makeshift walking stick I'd cut from a sapling near the parking area, wincing with each step. But determination drove me forward, past the point where I'd found Wilson's backpack, up toward the small plateau, where the trail veered sharply upward. I checked in with Betty at the half-hour mark as promised, reporting no findings so far. She told me the search team had moved further up the mountain, away from the area I'd described. They were still finding nothing. I continued upward, following the now familiar path. In daylight, with no fear clouding my judgment, I was able to orient myself better. I found the point where I'd gone off trail following the blood drops, and carefully made my way through the underbrush toward the clearing where I'd found Amanda. It looked different by day, smaller, less significant. Just a patch of open ground surrounded by pines. No signs of blood, no torn pieces of clothing in the trees. Nothing to indicate that a woman had died here, that I had fired my weapon at something inhuman. I searched methodically, covering every inch of the clearing and the surrounding forest. Nothing. It was as if the events of last night had been wiped away completely. Frustrated, I sat on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, trying to reconcile my vivid memories with the lack of evidence before me. Had I hallucinated the whole thing? Was I losing my mind? No. The injuries I'd sustained were real. The fear I'd felt was real. Something had happened here, something that defied explanation. I was about to give up and head back down when I noticed a small, dark object partially buried in the soft earth at the base of a tree. I dug it out carefully, a shell casing from my service weapon. Proof that I had fired my gun here, just as I remembered. I turned it over in my hand, feeling a mix of relief and renewed dread. I wasn't crazy, but if my memories were accurate, then so was the horror I'd witnessed. My radio crackled to life. "Grady, you're late checking in," Betty's worried voice came through. "Everything okay up there?" I keyed the mic. "Sorry, Betty, got distracted. I found a shell casing from my weapon, but no other sign of what happened last night. No bodies, no blood, nothing." "Shell casing is something," she replied. "Proves you fired your weapon at least. Sheriff's team is heading back down. They found nothing at all." "Tell them to be careful," I said, suddenly anxious. "These things, they don't just hunt at night." There was a pause. "What things, Grady? You never said exactly what attacked you." I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. "I'm not sure," I said finally. "Just tell them to be careful." I signed off and pocketed the shell casing. It wasn't much, but it was proof that part of my story was true. Maybe it would be enough to convince the sheriff to restrict access to this trail, at least temporarily. I was preparing to head back down when I noticed something, a subtle change in the quality of light filtering through the trees. It seemed dimmer somehow, though the sky overhead was still clear and blue. The forest sounds that had been a constant background all day, birds calling, squirrels chattering, wind in the branches, gradually faded to silence. And then I heard it, that familiar scraping sound coming from somewhere to my left. My heart began to race. This couldn't be happening, not in broad daylight. The creatures hunted at night, used darkness to their advantage. Didn't they? I drew my weapon and turned slowly toward the sound. The forest looked normal, just trees and underbrush and dappled sunlight. But the scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Then I saw the lights, not as bright as they had been at night, but still visible, drifting among the trees like fireflies that had forgotten how to blink. "No," I whispered, "not again." My radio crackled. "Grady?" Betty's voice, distant and broken with static. "You still there? Getting some weird feedback?" I reached for the radio, but before I could respond, it emitted a high-pitched squeal that made me drop it in pain. It hit the ground and went silent. The lights were moving closer now, forming those same complex patterns I'd seen the night before. And behind them, something large shifted among the trees, a dark shape that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than block it. I raised my weapon, knowing it was useless but unable to stop myself. "Stay back," I shouted. "I know what you are." A lie. I had no idea what these creatures were, only that they didn't belong in our world, in our reality. The scraping sound changed pitch, becoming almost musical. The light swirled faster, coalescing into that same column I'd seen in the clearing with the bodies. And within it, a shape began to form, human-like but indistinct, as if viewed through rippling water. It was Amanda again, or something wearing her appearance. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I found myself stepping closer, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The shape of Amanda raised a hand, beckoning. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. On the ground where the light column touched the earth, small objects glinted in the dirt. I took another step closer, straining to see. They were teeth, human teeth, dozens of them, arranged in a precise circular pattern around the base of the light column. Horror jolted me out of my trance. I stumbled backward, nearly falling as my injured ankle protested the sudden movement. The Amanda shape's expression changed, twisting into something that wasn't anger or frustration, but a more alien emotion I had no name for. The light surrounding her flared bright, almost painful to look at even in daylight. The forest darkened further, as if the sun was being eclipsed. The scraping sounds multiplied, coming from all directions now. They had me surrounded, just like in the clearing the night before. But this time, there was no moment of mercy, no chance to close my eyes and be spared. The dark shapes were closing in, moving with that same fluid grace that defied the laws of physics and biology. In desperation, I fired my weapon, not at the creatures, but at the column of light. The muzzle flash temporarily overwhelmed the unnatural darkness, and for a brief moment I saw everything clearly: the column, the teeth, and the creatures themselves, now fully visible in daylight. They were impossible. Even now, years later, I struggle to describe what I saw in that moment of clarity. Not because the memory has faded, it remains painfully sharp, but because human language lacks the vocabulary for such things. They had form, yes, but it was mutable, constantly shifting like smoke and wind. Parts that resembled fur or scales or skin merged and separated, textures flowing into one another. Limbs extended and retracted, never quite settling on a number or configuration. And where faces should have been, emptiness. Not blank spaces, but absences, as if those regions existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. My bullet struck the column of light, and something extraordinary happened. The light didn't shatter or disperse. It absorbed the impact, rippling like the surface of a pond. Then it began to change color, shifting from its mesmerizing white gold to a sickly green, then a deep, angry red. The Amanda shape within distorted, stretching into something no longer recognizably human. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, and this time I did hear its voice, not in my ears, but reverberating inside my skull. "You see us now." The pressure of those words was physical, driving me to my knees. My weapon slipped from nerveless fingers as I clutched my head, trying to block out that terrible voice. "You should not be able to see us, not in light." The scraping sounds had reached a fever pitch, almost like agitated conversation. The creatures were communicating, discussing this unexpected development. Through the pain, a realization dawned. They were surprised. Something about my ability to see them in daylight was wrong, was outside their experience. And if they could be surprised, they could be vulnerable. I forced myself to focus through the pain in my head. What was different about me? Why could I see them when apparently others couldn't? The answer came in a flash of insight: the shell casing. I still had it in my pocket, this small piece of metal that had been present during my first encounter with these things. Had it somehow been changed by its proximity to them? Had it marked me in some way? I fumbled in my pocket, fingers closing around the small brass cylinder. It was hot to the touch, almost burning, vibrating with energy it shouldn't possess. The creature nearest to me noticed my movement. It flowed closer. That absence of face turned toward my hand. The scraping changed tone, became urgent. On pure instinct, I threw the shell casing directly at the column of light. The moment the metal touched the light, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard tore through the forest. Not a screech or a roar, but something more fundamental, like reality itself crying out in pain. The column shuddered, its color cycling rapidly through the spectrum before settling on a deep, pulsing crimson. The creatures reacted immediately, their forms becoming even more unstable, limbs and appendages thrashing in what looked like agony or panic. The one closest to me reared back, its body elongating impossibly. And then, abruptly, the lights winked out. The column, the Amanda shape within it, simply ceased to exist. The forest was instantly flooded with normal daylight, birds resuming their calls as if nothing had happened. The creatures, however, remained. Without the strange light to mask them, they seemed more solid, more present in our reality. And they were angry. They converged on me from all sides, moving with terrifying speed. I scrambled for my weapon, knowing it was useless but unwilling to die without a fight. That's when the gunshots rang out, not from my service pistol, but from somewhere behind me. Heavy caliber, probably a hunting rifle. The rounds tore through the air, and to my astonishment, one of the creatures reacted, its fluid form rippling with what appeared to be pain. "McLean, get down!" Sheriff Davenport's voice. I dropped flat as another volley of shots rang out. The creatures scattered, retreating into the forest with that same liquid grace, but faster now, almost frantic. I rolled over to see Davenport and 3 members of the search team. all armed with hunting rifles, moving toward me in a practiced formation. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with shock at what they'd just witnessed. "What the hell were those things?" Deputy Roberts asked, his voice shaking despite his military background. I started to answer, then realized they could see them. In broad daylight, without the shell casing or any previous encounter, they could see the creatures. "You saw them?" I asked, struggling to my feet. "All of you?" Sheriff Davenport nodded grimly. "Hard to miss. Never seen anything like it in 40 years outdoors. What are they?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But they're what killed those hikers. They're what I shot at last night." Ranger Stevens was scanning the forest, his rifle at the ready. "They're still out there. I can feel them watching." He was right. The forest had gone silent again, the weight of inhuman attention pressing in from all sides. The creatures hadn't fled. They'd simply withdrawn to regroup. "We need to get off this mountain," I said. "Now, before they come back." No one argued. With practiced efficiency, the search team formed a defensive perimeter around me as we began making our way back to the trail. My injured ankle slowed our pace, but adrenaline dulled the pain enough that I could move without assistance. We'd gone perhaps 50 yards when the forest ahead of us darkened, the trees seeming to bend and twist in ways that wood shouldn't be able to move. The path we'd been following disappeared, replaced by dense underbrush that hadn't been there moments before. "They're hurting us," Ranger Stevens said quietly, "just like they did with you last night." Sheriff Davenport checked his compass. "This way," he said, indicating a direction perpendicular to our original path. "The main trail should be about a quarter-mile east." We adjusted course, moving as quickly and quietly as possible through the increasingly dense forest. The sense of being watched, of being followed, never diminished. Occasionally, one of us would catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of our vision, a dark shape flowing from tree to tree, keeping pace with us but maintaining distance. "Why aren't they attacking?" Deputy Roberts whispered. "They've got us outnumbered." "I don't think they're sure what to do about us," I replied. "Something's changed. They didn't expect us to be able to see them in daylight." The shell casing, I thought. Something about it had disrupted whatever mechanism they used to remain hidden. And now that disruption had somehow spread, affecting not just me but everyone nearby. We continued on, the tension building with each step. The forest seemed to be actively working against us now, branches reaching like hands to snag clothing, roots rising to trip unwary feet, the very light filtering through the canopy playing tricks on our eyes. Then suddenly, we broke through into a clearing, not a natural one, but a massive circle where trees had been uprooted and vegetation cleared away. At its center stood a stone formation that looked almost like an altar, ancient and worn smooth by time. And on that altar lay bodies, dozens of them, arranged in concentric circles, their limbs positioned with geometric precision. Men, women, people of all ages and types in various states of decay. Some looked recent, including Wilson and Amanda, their features still recognizable despite the wounds that had killed them. Others were little more than skeletons, clothing rotted away, bones bleached white by sun and time. "Mother of God," Davenport breathed. "How long has this been going on?" Ranger Stevens moved closer to the altar, his experienced eye scanning the remains. Based on decomposition of the oldest bodies, years, maybe decades. The implications were staggering. These creatures had been hunting here for generations, taking people from the trails, from campgrounds, from lonely cabins in the woods, and no one had connected the dots, had realized what was happening, because no one could see them. No one survived to tell the tale. Until me. The scraping sound began again, louder now, coming from the forest surrounding the clearing. The creatures were gathering, their dark shapes visible among the trees, more of them than I'd seen before. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, all watching with that same hungry attention. "We're surrounded," Deputy Roberts said, raising his rifle. "No way we can fight this many." He was right. Even with 4 armed men, we couldn't hope to fend off what looked like an entire colony of these things. But I noticed something. They weren't advancing. They remained at the edge of the clearing, scraping and shifting but making no move to attack. They were waiting for something. The air in the center of the clearing began to shimmer like heat rising from asphalt on a summer day. The bodies on the altar seemed to glow from within, a sickly phosphorescence that made my stomach turn. Then the lights appeared again, not the mesmerizing points of radiance from before, but a single massive column of light that erupted from the center of the altar, shooting upward into the sky like a beacon. Within that column, shapes began to form, human figures, transparent and ethereal. I recognized some of them: Amanda Wilson, the older hiker I'd seen in the moonlit clearing. Others were strangers, people who had disappeared over the years, their cases gone cold, their families left without closure. They were all here, preserved somehow in this impossible light. "What are we seeing?" Sheriff Davenport asked, his voice barely audible. I think," I said slowly, the terrible truth dawning on me. "I think they're not just killing people, they're collecting them, harvesting something that survives after death." The human shapes in the light column seemed to be trying to communicate, their mouths moving, hands reaching toward us. But no sound emerged, no clear message could be discerned. One figure, however, separated from the others, drifting to the edge of the column closest to me. Amanda. Her expression was intense, focused, as her lips formed the same words over and over. This time I understood. "The shell," I whispered. "It has to be destroyed. The altar. It's the anchor." I turned to Sheriff Davenport. "We need to destroy that altar. It's what's holding them here, what gives them access to our world." He looked skeptical, but nodded. "Worth a try. Roberts, you got any explosives in that pack of yours?" Deputy Roberts had been a combat engineer in the Army before joining the Coram PD. He nodded, unslinging his backpack. "Emergency demolition kit. Not much, but might be enough to crack that stone." The creatures at the forest edge became agitated, the scraping sounds increasing in tempo and volume. They recognized the threat, understood what we intended to do. "They're going to try to stop us," Ranger Stevens warned, raising his rifle. "We need to buy Roberts time." Davenport and Stevens positioned themselves on either side of the clearing, rifles ready. I retrieved my service weapon from where I'd dropped it during the encounter. "How much time do you need?" I asked Roberts. 2 minutes, he replied, already removing blocks of plastic explosive from his pack. "Maybe 3. Have to set it right, or we'll just chip the surface." "You've got it," Davenport said grimly. "McLean, stay with him. We'll keep those things off your backs." The creatures began to advance, flowing from the tree line with that impossible grace. Davenport fired first, his shot striking one of the larger entities. It didn't fall or bleed, but its form rippled violently, temporarily losing cohesion. So they could be hurt, at least temporarily. Stevens opened fire as well, creating a crossfire that forced the creatures to be more cautious in their approach. I stationed myself directly in front of Roberts, service weapon raised, ready to engage anything that got past the initial line of defense. Roberts worked with practiced efficiency, placing charges at key structural points around the altar. The creatures continued their advance, moving erratically to make themselves more difficult targets. For each one that was temporarily disrupted by gunfire, 2 more took its place. "Almost done," Roberts called. 30 seconds. The column of light began to pulse, its color shifting toward that angry red I'd seen earlier. The human shapes within became more agitated, their silent mouths open in what looked like screams of warning. "Look out!" Stephen shouted as one creature, larger than the others, surged forward with unexpected speed. It reached him before he could fire again, a limb-like appendage lashing out to knock the rifle from his hands. Davenport shifted his aim, putting 3 rounds into the thing attacking Stevens. It shuddered, parts of its form becoming transparent, but didn't relent. "Done," Roberts announced. "Detonator set for 30 seconds. Everyone clear the area." We began backing away from the altar, maintaining our defensive formation. The creatures, sensing our intention, abandoned all caution. They swarmed forward en masse, a tide of shifting, flowing darkness converging on our position. "Run," Davenport ordered. "Now." We broke into a sprint, heading for the tree line opposite from where most of the creatures had gathered. My injured ankle screamed in protest, but adrenaline carried me forward. We'd made it perhaps halfway to the trees when the lights in the column suddenly extinguished, plunging the clearing into relative darkness. The creatures froze momentarily, then changed direction with eerie coordination, no longer pursuing us but racing back toward the altar. "They're trying to disarm the charges," Roberts realized. "We can't let them reach it." Davenport skidded to a stop, raising his rifle. "Keep going. I'll slow them down." Before we could argue, he opened fire, his shots precise despite the chaos. Each impact disrupted a creature's form temporarily, buying precious seconds. 10 seconds to detonation. The fastest of the creatures had nearly reached the altar. 5 seconds. Davenport's rifle clicked empty. The creatures swarmed over the stone structure, their forms merging and separating as they worked to locate and disable the explosives. The explosion was far more powerful than the small amount of plastic explosive should have produced. The flash of light was blinding, the concussion throwing us off our feet, despite our distance from the blast point. When my vision cleared, I saw that the altar had been completely destroyed, reduced to rubble and dust. The creatures surrounding it had been caught in the blast, their forms scattered like mist in a strong wind. But the most dramatic effect was happening above the blast point. The sky itself seemed to be tearing open, a rift forming in the very fabric of reality. Through that rift, I caught a glimpse of somewhere else. Not stars or space as we understand it, but a realm of shifting colors and impossible geometries, of light that moved with purpose and darkness that watched with hunger. The remaining creatures were being drawn toward this rift, their forms stretching and elongating as they were pulled upward. They didn't fight it, didn't resist. It was as if they recognized this as an inevitable conclusion, a closing of a door that should never have been opened. The human shapes appeared one last time, hovering at the edge of the rift, Wilson, Amanda, and all the others. Their expressions were peaceful now, free of the torment they'd shown earlier. As we watched, they began to fade, not being drawn into the rift, but simply dissolving like mist under the morning sun. The rift itself lasted only seconds before collapsing with a sound like distant thunder. The forest was suddenly completely normal again, just trees and underbrush and the scattered remains of the stone altar. No creatures, no lights, no sense of being watched by hungry, ancient eyes. It was over. We regrouped in the clearing, all of us shaken but alive. Sheriff Davenport rejoined us, his rifle empty but otherwise unharmed. "What the hell just happened?" he asked, staring at the rubble where the altar had stood. None of us had an answer, not then. The hike back down to the trailhead was conducted in stunned silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we'd witnessed. We found the main trail easily, with none of the disorientation or manipulation we'd experienced earlier. It was as if the forest had returned to being just a forest, no longer an extension of alien will. Back at the station, we were faced with a dilemma. What to tell people? Who would believe the truth? In the end, Sheriff Davenport made the decision. The official report stated that Wilson Reed and Amanda Blake had died in a tragic accident, their bodies recovered from a ravine near Eagle Ridge Trail. No mention was made of other remains, though anonymous tips later led to the discovery of several long-missing hikers in various remote locations around Glacier National Park. The four of us who had witnessed the truth made a pact that night. We would never speak publicly about what we'd seen, what we'd learned about the ancient predators that had hunted in our mountains. The world wasn't ready for such knowledge, might never be ready. But privately, we researched. We found old tales and Native American folklore about hollow ones who lured travelers with beautiful lights. We discovered historical records of disappearances dating back to the first European explorers in the region. And we found other stone formations, smaller but similar to the altar we'd destroyed, hidden throughout the wilderness areas of Montana and beyond. Over the years that followed, the four of us quietly located and destroyed these structures whenever we found them. Sometimes we encountered resistance, strange weather, equipment malfunctions, unexplained illnesses, but never again did we see the creatures themselves. With their anchor point destroyed, their access to our world seemed to have been severed, or so we believed. I left Coram in 2001, no longer able to look at those mountains without remembering what had dwelled among them. I moved to Colorado, Took a job with a small sheriff's department in the San Juan Range. Tried to build a normal life, but occasionally, hiking in remote areas, I catch glimpses of lights among the trees. Beautiful, mesmerizing lights that almost form patterns, almost communicate. I never follow them, never investigate. Some doors, once closed, should remain that way. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I still hear that scraping sound, like stone on stone, like ancient entities attempting to speak, like something trying to find its way back. I don't have much to say about 1994, except that it was the year I decided to take a long road trip across Pennsylvania, hoping to clear my head. I was living in Philadelphia, just trying to make ends meet as a freelance graphic designer. Life had become this constant blur of deadlines and bills, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped in a box. So I packed up my old beat-up Honda Civic and hit the road. My only plan was to head west and see where it would take me. The winter had been particularly harsh that year, leaving behind a spring that couldn't seem to make up its mind. Some days were warm and inviting, while others carried a biting chill that reminded you winter wasn't quite ready to release its grip. That morning when I left Philadelphia, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, with wisps of clouds stretched thin across the horizon. I remember turning the key in the ignition, feeling the familiar rumble of my car coming to life beneath me. The dashboard was cluttered with old coffee cups and crumpled receipts, evidence of a life lived paycheck to paycheck. Before pulling away from the curb, I glanced up at my apartment window. 3 years I'd lived there, and I felt nothing looking at it now. That should have been my first warning. The initial stretch of highway felt predictable, with the same exits, the same gas stations, the same billboards I'd seen countless times before. The monotony was almost comforting, a reminder that some things never changed. But as I pushed westward, past Lancaster and into the rolling hills beyond, something inside me began to shift. The landscape grew less familiar, more untamed. By noon, I'd stopped at a roadside diner, one of those places frozen in time. The vinyl booths were cracked with age, the countertops stained from decades of coffee spills. A waitress named Joan, her name tag faded but still legible, brought me a plate of eggs and toast. She had the look of someone who had seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. "Where you headed?" she asked, refilling my coffee without waiting for an answer. "West," I said, realizing how inadequate that sounded. "Just driving." She nodded, like she understood completely. Sometimes that's all you need. Back on the road, I found myself thinking about Joan's words. Maybe that was all I needed. Movement, distance, the illusion of progress. The highway stretched before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through increasingly forested hills. Signs for the Allegheny National Forest began to appear, and something about those vast stretches of trees called to me. By the time I crossed into the Allegheny National Forest, I was tired of the main highways. The heavy traffic, the fast food stops, the endless stretches of asphalt. All of it was getting under my skin. I saw a turnoff that led deeper into the forest. A narrow, unpaved road that seemed to promise solitude, the kind of quiet that I needed. I figured I'd take a detour, find some place to camp for the night, and get back on my way in the morning. The road was nothing but dirt and gravel. The decision to turn off the highway wasn't calculated, it was impulsive, a sudden urge to break away from the predetermined path. The sign was small, weathered wood with faded lettering. Forest Service Road, 27. It wasn't marked on my map, which only added to its appeal. I turned the wheel sharply, feeling the car lurch as the tires left smooth pavement for the rough embrace of gravel. The transition was immediate and stark. One moment, I was surrounded by the familiar sounds of civilization. Distant engines, the hum of power lines, the occasional blast of a truck horn. The next, I was enveloped in a green silence, broken only by the crunch of stones beneath my tires and the whisper of wind through leaves. The road narrowed quickly, forcing me to slow down. Branches reached out from both sides, occasionally scraping against the car's windows with a sound like fingernails. The forest grew denser with each passing mile, creating a canopy overhead that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the road before me. I rolled down the window, letting in the smell of damp earth and pine. There was something else beneath those scents, something older and more primal that I couldn't quite identify. The air felt heavy, as if the forest itself was breathing around me, watching with countless unseen eyes. It was exhilarating at first, this feeling of discovery, of venturing off the mapped world into something wild and unknown. I hadn't felt this alive in months, maybe years. The monotony of my life in Philadelphia seemed impossibly distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. The road snaked between trees that grew denser the farther I went. There were no signs, no markers, just this feeling that I was going deeper into the middle of nowhere. I didn't mind, though. It was exactly what I wanted. Eventually, the road started to wind downhill, and before I knew it, I was too far in to turn back easily. As the elevation dropped, the character of the forest changed. The pines gave way to older hardwoods, massive oaks and maples, whose branches formed a cathedral-like ceiling above. Their roots broke through the soil on either side of the road, creating an obstacle course that forced me to navigate with increasing care. I glanced at my watch, almost 4 in the afternoon. I had been driving on this road for longer than I realized, lulled into a strange trance by the rhythmic sway of the car and the hypnotic pattern of light and shadow. My gas gauge hovered just above a quarter tank. Not critical yet, but concerning enough that I began to question my decision. After about an hour of driving, the sky began to dim. I realized I hadn't passed a single car, house, or any sign of life for miles. That's when the first pang of doubt hit me. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all, but by then, it was too late to backtrack. The forest had closed in around me, and the road was narrow, barely wide enough for my car to squeeze through in some spots. I pressed on, telling myself I'd find a clearing soon. It wasn't until I saw the cabin that I felt a strange sense of relief. The cabin appeared suddenly around a sharp bend in the road, nestled on a small ridge overlooking a creek. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It seemed to shimmer slightly in the fading light, like a mirage that might vanish if I blinked. But it remained, solid and unmistakably real. The wood was old, weathered, like it had been there for decades, possibly longer. The logs had turned a deep silvery gray, with patches of green moss creeping up the northern side. 2 small windows faced the road, their glass so dirty they reflected only a dull sheen rather than any actual light. A narrow porch stretched across the front, sagging slightly in the middle, as if bearing an invisible weight. The place wasn't exactly welcoming. No lights, no car outside, just the stillness of the woods around it. But it was shelter, and I thought maybe someone there could give me directions. I pulled up to the side of the cabin and killed the engine. As soon as the sound of the car faded, I felt the weight of the silence settle in. It was the kind of silence you only get in places far removed from civilization. No hum of electricity, no distant rumble of highways, just trees, the faint sound of the creek, and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. I sat in the car for a minute, suddenly reluctant to get out. The forest had grown darker around me, the trees now just looming silhouettes against a deepening blue sky. A few early stars had appeared, pinpricks of light in the gathering dusk. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath fogging the windshield. Something about the cabin seemed off, though I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. Perhaps it was too perfect, too much like something out of an old horror movie, the isolated cabin in the woods. Or maybe it was the complete absence of life around it. No woodpile, no tools leaning against the wall, no footprints in the dirt. It looked abandoned, and yet not quite abandoned enough. I got out and walked toward the cabin, feeling the hair on the back of my neck rise. Something wasn't right, but I pushed the feeling down. I knocked on the door, hoping for a quick exchange, maybe a map. Then I'd be back on the road. No one answered. I knocked again, louder this time. The sound echoed strangely, too loud in the stillness of the forest. I waited, counting my heartbeats. 10, 20, 30. Still nothing. I figured the place might be abandoned, or maybe whoever lived there was out. But then I noticed the door wasn't completely shut. A gap in the doorframe, just wide enough for a sliver of darkness to peek through. I peered through this gap, trying to make out anything in the gloom beyond. The interior was dark, but I could just barely discern shapes. Furniture, perhaps, and what might have been a table or desk against the far wall. No movement, no sound. My gut told me to leave it alone, get back in my car and drive. But my curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open a little more and called out, "Hello, anyone home?" No answer. The hinges protested with a long, pained creak as I pushed the door wider. The sound sent a shiver down my spine like the cabin itself was groaning in protest at my intrusion. I hesitated at the threshold, one foot still firmly planted in the outside world, the other poised to step into the unknown darkness. I called out once more, my voice sounding thin and insignificant in the vastness of the silence. The only response was the distant call of some bird I didn't recognize, a harsh, barking sound that seemed more warning than song. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. It was a mix of old wood, mildew, and something else, something foul, like rotting meat. The inside was dark, but there was just enough light coming through the windows for me to see the dust hanging in the air, thick as fog. I covered my nose with my sleeve, trying to filter out the worst of the stench. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim interior, revealing details in increments. The cabin was a single room, larger than it had appeared from outside. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and empty, with ancient soot stains licking up the surrounding stones like black flames frozen in time. The cabin was cluttered with old furniture and strange trinkets, animal bones, jars filled with things I didn't want to think about, and a table piled high with rusted tools. It looked like the kind of place where someone had lived off the grid for a long time, maybe too long. A bed stood in one corner, its sheets twisted and stained. Not recently used, but not long abandoned either. The mattress was thin, showing the outline of the metal frame beneath. Above it hung something that took me a moment to identify. A dream catcher, but not like any I'd seen before. This one was made with what looked like real sinew and bones, with dark feathers hanging from it that seemed to twitch slightly in the still air. Against another wall stood a bookshelf, sagging under the weight of dozens of volumes. I stepped closer, curious despite my growing unease. The books were old, their spines cracked and faded, titles barely legible. Most appeared to be about local history, wilderness survival, and strangely, anatomy. One large volume lay open on a nearby chair, its pages covered in handwritten notes and diagrams that I couldn't make sense of in the dim light. A collection of knives was mounted on a board above a crude wooden desk. Not kitchen knives, hunting knives, skinning knives, tools designed for taking apart living things. They gleamed dully in the fading light, well used but meticulously maintained. On the desk itself lay maps, dozens of them, overlapping and marked with red circles and strange symbols. I recognized the general geography. We were deep in the Allegheny forest. But many of the markings corresponded to places not on any official map I'd ever seen. My foot caught on something, and I looked down to see a stained threadbare rug. The pattern might once have been intricate and colorful, but years of dirt and wear had reduced it to a murky blur of faded browns and reds. Something about it drew my attention, though. It seemed out of place, too deliberate in its positioning in the center of the cabin floor. I lifted the corner of it with my toe, and that's when I saw the trap door. It was small, just big enough for one person to fit through, with a rusty handle sticking up from the floor. Something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't want to open it, but it was like I didn't have a choice. I stood staring at that handle for what felt like an eternity. Every instinct told me to back away, to leave the cabin and never return. And yet I couldn't. Some morbid curiosity, some need to know what lay beneath that door, kept me rooted to the spot. Outside, the light was fading quickly. Soon I would be in complete darkness. I had a flashlight in my car, but the thought of stepping outside only to return seemed absurd. If I was going to leave, I should leave for good. If I was going to stay, to look, then it had to be now. My hand moved on its own, gripping the handle and pulling. The trapdoor resisted at first, as if reluctant to reveal its secrets, then gave way with a sudden jerk that nearly pulled me off balance. The smell got worse, much worse. A wave of decay washed over me and I gagged, covering my nose with my sleeve. But I couldn't stop now. I grabbed my phone from my pocket, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it into the darkness below. The beam of light from my phone cut through the darkness like a knife, revealing a narrow wooden ladder descending into a dirt-floored cellar. The walls were raw earth, held back by crude wooden supports that looked as if they might give way at any moment. The air rising from below was cold and damp, carrying that overwhelming stench of decay. I hesitated for a second, then started to climb down. Each rung of the ladder creaked ominously under my weight, threatening to snap and send me tumbling into the darkness below. I moved slowly, testing each step before trusting it with my full weight. My feet hit the dirt floor and the stench became unbearable. I waved my phone around, trying to get a better look. The cellar was larger than I expected, extending beyond the footprint of the cabin above. The ceiling was low, forcing me to stoop slightly. The walls were lined with more shelves, these filled with jars containing liquids and objects I couldn't identify in the dim light. That's when I saw the first body. It was a man, lying on his side, face twisted in a final scream. His skin was pale, almost waxy, and his limbs were bent at unnatural angles. There were deep gashes across his chest and neck, dried blood staining the dirt around him. But what stuck with me the most was his hands. They were missing fingers, and the stubs looked chewed off. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the earthen wall with enough force to send a shower of dirt down on my head. My phone nearly slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, and I fumbled to maintain my grip on it, unwilling to lose my only source of light in this nightmare. The man had been dead for some time, days, maybe weeks, but not long enough for full decomposition. His clothes were outdoor gear, hiking boots, cargo pants, a flannel shirt now stiff with dried blood. A backpack lay nearby, torn open, its contents scattered across the dirt floor. A tourist, perhaps, a hiker who, like me, had strayed from the marked trails and found this place. But he wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted further to the gloom, I realized with mounting horror that there were other shapes in the darkness. Other bodies. 3 more, at least, in various states of decay. Some were little more than skeletons, with scraps of clothing and flesh still clinging to their bones. Others were more recent, their features still recognizable in death's grimace. They were arranged in a rough circle around a central point, a small pit dug into the earth floor. I forced myself to step closer, to shine my light into that hole. It was filled with a dark liquid that my mind initially registered as water, but that I now realized, with a surge of revulsion, was blood. Not fresh, but not fully dried either, congealed and thick, with a surface that reflected my light with a dull, sick gleam. Around the pit, small objects had been arranged with obvious care. Finger bones, teeth, what looked like strips of preserved skin. Trophies, relics, the evidence of ritual and purpose that turned random death into something far more terrifying. Deliberate slaughter. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I needed to get out, to run, to find help. But my body seemed frozen in place, locked in a rictus of fear, as complete and final as the expressions on the dead faces surrounding me. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Someone was above me in the cabin. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The footsteps grew louder, and I could hear the floorboards creaking under the weight of someone moving around upstairs. The steps were not the uncertain movements of someone exploring an abandoned place. They were purposeful, familiar. Whoever was up there knew every squeaky board, every loose nail. They moved with the confidence of someone returning home. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find the trapdoor. But I already knew it was open, left gaping by my hasty descent. There was no way they wouldn't notice it. My only hope was to hide, to somehow blend into the shadows and earth of this charnel house. I edged along the wall, moving as quietly as possible, seeking some recess or corner where I might escape notice. My foot struck something soft. Another body. This one so far gone that it had collapsed in on itself, a deflated husk of what had once been human. I bit back a scream, clamping my hand over my mouth so hard I tasted blood. But then the creaking stopped. Silence, except for the rapid thumping in my chest. I thought maybe they'd left. Maybe I was in the clear. But then, the trap door creaked open wider. Light flooded down, blinding me for a second, and then I saw them. 2 men, or at least what used to be men. The light came from an old-fashioned lantern, its flame casting long, distorted shadows across the cellar floor. It swung gently from the hand of the taller of the 2 figures, creating a nightmarish dance of light and dark that seemed to animate the dead bodies around me. Their faces were twisted, disfigured, their skin hanging loose like it had been stretched too far. Their clothes were ragged, stained with something dark, and their eyes, dead, empty, like they weren't seeing me at all, just looking through me. The taller one had what might once have been a handsome face, now ruined by a massive scar that ran from his forehead to his jaw, pulling his features into a permanent leer. His companion was shorter, stockier, with a shock of wild gray hair, and a beard so matted with filth, it looked more like moss growing on his face than human hair. They were talking to each other in low voices, a dialect I couldn't quite make out. English, but corrupted somehow, with unfamiliar cadences and words that slurred together in patterns that made no sense to my ears. It sounded ancient, as if they'd been isolated from the world for generations, developing their own private language. The tall one gestured toward where I was hiding, saying something that ended in a harsh bark of laughter. The shorter one nodded, then began to descend the ladder, the wood groaning under his weight. One of them dropped into the cellar, landing just a few feet from me. I scrambled backward, my hand brushing against something cold and hard. It was a rusted shovel caked with dirt. I grabbed it, holding it in front of me like it was the only thing between me and whatever these things were. The shorter man shuffled toward me, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a puppet with half its strings cut. In the swinging light of the lantern, I could see his eyes better now, milky white, with pupils so dilated they seemed to swallow most of the iris. Blind, perhaps, or nearly so, but he moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where everything was. "Fresh meat," he said, his voice a rasp, like dead leaves being crushed underfoot. "Been a while since one walked right in." The taller one laughed again, a sound like stones grinding together. "Always taste better when they come willing," he said, starting down the ladder himself. Their casual discussion of eating me sent a surge of adrenaline through my body so intense it was painful. This was no misunderstanding. This was no chance encounter with eccentric backwoods dwellers. These men were predators, and I was prey. The shorter one reached for me, his hand emerging from his tattered sleeve like a pale spider. His nails were long, yellow, curved like claws. I could see dried blood crusted in the creases of his palm. I swung the shovel with everything I had. It connected with his head, and there was a sickening crack. He fell to the ground, twitching, blood pooling under his skull. The taller one roared, not in words, but in a primal sound of rage that seemed to shake dust from the ceiling. He launched himself off the ladder, clearing the remaining distance in a single bound that no normal human could have managed. I didn't have time to think. The other one was coming down the ladder. I ran for the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear him behind me, his breath ragged and wet, like something was broken inside him. He caught the back of my jacket, yanking me backward with such force that I lost my grip on the shovel. It clattered to the ground as I stumbled, nearly falling into his grasp. I twisted free, leaving him holding a torn piece of fabric. In the lantern light, I could see his face clearly for the first time. His teeth were not human teeth. They were filed to points, like a shark's mouth transposed onto a human face. Some were broken, others missing entirely, but those that remained looked capable of tearing flesh from bone with terrifying efficiency. "You'll regret that," he hissed, gesturing to his fallen companion. "We take our time with the fighters. Make it last." I backed toward the ladder, feeling for the rungs behind me without taking my eyes off him. He moved slowly now, savoring the moment, confident in his inevitable victory. He'd done this before, many times. The bodies surrounding us were testament to that. My foot found the bottom rung, and I began to climb backward, one hand still extended in front of me, as if I could somehow ward him off. He watched me, head tilted in a curious, animal way, like a predator studying the desperate maneuvers of cornered prey. Then he lunged. I scrambled up the ladder, feeling his fingers close around my ankle. I kicked wildly, connecting with something. His face, his shoulder, I couldn't tell, and heard him growl in pain. His grip loosened just enough for me to pull free and continue my frantic climb. I reached the top and clawed my way out of the trapdoor, rolling onto the cabin floor. My hands were slick with sweat and dirt, making it hard to grip anything. I could hear him coming up the ladder behind me, his movements quick and agile despite his bulk. I reached the top and slammed the trapdoor shut, dragging the nearest piece of furniture over it. A heavy wooden dresser. It wouldn't hold him for long, but it might buy me enough time to escape. I ran for the door, but as I reached it, I heard a tremendous crash behind me. The trap door had burst open, sending the dresser toppling over. The man emerged from the cellar like a demon rising from hell, his face now streaked with blood. Whether his or his companions, I couldn't tell. He moved with inhuman speed, cutting off my path to the door. I backpedaled, looking frantically for another exit, another weapon, anything that might give me a chance. The window, small but maybe big enough to squeeze through. I feinted toward the door, then changed direction abruptly, diving toward the window. Glass shattered around me as I crashed through, feeling shards tear at my skin. I tumbled to the ground outside, the impact driving the air from my lungs. No time to recover, no time to think. I staggered to my feet and ran. The forest closed around me like a dark embrace. Trees loomed on all sides, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, scratching at my face and clothes as I ran blindly into their midst. I had no direction, no plan, only the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between myself and the cabin. Behind me, I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, following my trail with unerring accuracy. He moved faster than I would have thought possible, covering ground with long, loping strides that ate up the distance between us. I didn't care which direction I was going as long as it was away from that place. The branches tore at my clothes, scratched my arms and face, but I kept running. The forest seemed to go on forever, the trees closing in around me, but I didn't stop. The ground sloped downward, and I nearly lost my footing on the loose soil and rocks. I caught myself against a tree trunk, the rough bark tearing at my palms. For just a moment, I paused, straining to listen. The sounds of pursuit seemed more distant now, but still there. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the occasional grunt of effort. The moon had risen, casting just enough light through the canopy to turn the world into a shifting pattern of silver and black. It transformed the forest into something alien and hostile, full of deceptive shadows and false paths. I pushed on, trying to move more quietly now, picking my way through the undergrowth with greater care. My initial panic had subsided enough for me to think, to strategize. Running blindly would only tire me out. I needed to be smarter than that. I remembered the creek I'd seen from the cabin. Water would mask my scent, confuse my trail. If I could find it, follow it downstream, I might have a chance. I changed direction, moving laterally across the slope rather than straight down. The terrain grew rockier, more treacherous. Several times I slipped, once falling hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs. I lay there gasping, certain that he would be upon me at any moment. But the sounds of pursuit had faded, lost in the natural chorus of the night forest. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the darkness, I heard it, the soft gurgle of moving water. I followed the sound until I reached the bank of a narrow creek, its surface reflecting the moonlight like a ribbon of silver snaking through the trees. Without hesitation, I waded in. The water was shockingly cold, numbing my legs almost instantly. But I welcomed the pain, used it to clear my head, to focus my thoughts. I moved downstream, keeping to the middle of the creek where the water was deepest, leaving no footprints on the banks. The creek widened gradually, its current growing stronger. It pulled at me, urging me forward, as if the water itself was eager to carry me away from that nightmare place. I allowed it to guide me, conserving my strength, letting the current do the work. Eventually, the forest began to thin. The trees stood further apart, allowing more moonlight to reach the ground. And then, miraculously, I saw it, a gleam of smooth, regular surface that could only be man-made, a road. Hope surged through me, giving me a final burst of energy. I scrambled up the bank, my clothes heavy with water, my limbs stiff with cold. The road was narrow, paved but poorly maintained, with weeds pushing up through cracks in the asphalt. But it was civilization. It was escape. I flagged down the first car I saw, a rusted pickup truck driven by an elderly man with a weather-beaten face and suspicious eyes. I must have looked like a madman, soaking wet, covered in scratches, wild-eyed with fear and exhaustion. But something in my expression must have convinced him of my desperation because he stopped. "You all right, son?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I couldn't find the words to explain what had happened, so I simply said, "I got lost in the forest. Need to get to the nearest town." He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Hop in." As we drove away, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see a twisted figure emerge from the trees in pursuit, but the road behind us remained empty, swallowed by darkness as we rounded a bend. "A lot of folks get lost in these woods," the old man said after several minutes of silence. "Not all of them find their way out." I looked at him sharply, searching his face for hidden meaning, but his expression revealed nothing beyond mild concern. "There's places in there," he continued. "Places most folks don't know about, don't want to know about." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He shrugged. "Just old stories. Been around since I was a boy. Disappearances, strange lights, folks who come back, changed." He glanced at me. "Not the kind of thing most people believe nowadays." I said nothing, but my silence must have spoken volumes. "You saw something in there, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I began, then stopped. How could I possibly explain what I'd encountered? Who would believe me? "I just got lost," I said finally. "It was dark. My mind played tricks on me." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe my denial. "Well, whatever you saw, you're one of the lucky ones. You made it out." When I finally got to a gas station, I collapsed against the wall, my mind still reeling from what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone the full story, just that I got lost, that I needed help. Who would believe me anyway? But I know what I saw in that cellar, and I know those things are still out there in the woods, waiting for the next lost soul to wander too far off the beaten path. The police were called, of course. They took my statement, noted my injuries, asked if I could lead them back to where I'd been. But I couldn't. In my panicked flight through the forest, I'd lost all sense of direction, and part of me, a larger part than I cared to admit, was terrified of going back there, of finding that cabin again. They searched, perfunctorily, found nothing, chalked it up to another tourist getting lost in the vast wilderness of the Allegheny Forest. Perhaps they thought I'd hallucinated, driven to delusion by fear and exhaustion. Perhaps they were right. But in the years since, I've researched, quietly, carefully, never drawing attention to myself. I've found records of disappearances stretching back decades. Hikers, campers, people passing through who were never seen again. Too many to be coincidence, too few to draw official concern. Sometimes I dream of that cellar, of those bodies arranged in their gruesome circle, of those men, if they were men at all, and their filed teeth and dead eyes. I wake gasping, the smell of decay so vivid I have to check that I'm still in my own bedroom, safe in the mundane world of alarm clocks and coffee makers. As for me, I'll never go back into the Allegheny National Forest, not after what I saw. But sometimes on cold nights when the wind sounds too much like labored breathing, I wonder if they remember me, if they're still there, waiting, patient in their hunger. And I wonder how many others have stumbled upon that cabin since then, seeking shelter, finding only teeth in the darkness. I've been a ranger at Evergreen National Forest for nearly 15 years. Most city folk imagine my job consists of watching for forest fires from a lookout tower and occasionally helping tourists find the bathroom. They have no idea what it really means to be the thin green line between civilization and wilderness. My station sits on the northwestern edge of the forest, about 40 miles from the nearest town. It's a small cabin with a radio system, basic medical supplies, and enough provisions to last through the harsh winter months when the road becomes impassable. The isolation never bothered me. It was what I signed up for when I took this posting after 3 years working the more tourist-friendly southern sector. 2 nights ago, everything changed. I was making my evening rounds, checking the perimeter of my area as the sun dipped below the tree line. The October air carried that distinctive chill that signals winter isn't far behind. The forest was quieter than usual. No birds calling, no squirrels chattering, just the occasional creak of branches in the wind. When I reached Miller's Creek, I noticed something odd on the far bank. The mud showed a set of prints unlike anything I'd documented in 15 years of wildlife tracking. They were enormous, easily 16 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Bear tracks show 5 toes too, but these didn't have claw marks extending beyond the toes, and the shape was all wrong, more humanoid than ursine. I photographed them with my digital camera, placed my knife beside one for scale, and logged the coordinates in my journal. The scientific part of my brain insisted they must belong to a particularly large black bear with unusual gait, perhaps injured. But another part, the primal part that humans carry from our days as prey rather than predators, whispered something else entirely. As darkness fell completely, I heard a sound that froze me in place. A long, low vocalization, not quite a howl, not quite a moan, echoed through the valley. It carried notes that were almost human in their modulation, but possessed a resonance no human throat could produce. The hair on my arm stood straight up. Whatever made that sound was big. I quickened my pace back to the station, constantly scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Twice I caught what appeared to be eye shine reflecting back from the darkness, positioned at least 7 feet off the ground, too tall for a bear standing on its hind legs. When I reached the station, I radioed headquarters but got only static in return. The first winter storm was rolling in, creating interference. I was on my own. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I reviewed old incident reports, searching for similar observations. 3 years ago, a group of hikers reported an unusual bipedal animal in the northeastern quadrant. The official explanation was a black bear. 5 years before that, 2 hunters claimed their camp was circled by something large walking on 2 legs for hours during the night. Their report was dismissed as the effects of hypothermia setting in, but neither report mentioned tracks like the ones I'd found. The next morning brought fresh snow, 4 inches that transformed the forest into a pristine white landscape. I set out to check the area around Miller's Creek again, hoping to find more evidence before the storm covered everything. My training taught me to maintain a professional distance, to observe and document, without letting imagination color my perception. But 20 years in these woods had also taught me something else. When the forest feels wrong, something is wrong. The forest felt wrong that morning. The silence was absolute, as if every living creature was holding its breath. My footsteps sounded obscenely loud as I trudged through the new snow. When I reached the creek, I found what I was looking for, and immediately wished I hadn't. A new set of tracks crossed my own trail from the previous evening. The same enormous humanoid prints, now perfectly preserved in fresh snow. They originated from the densest part of the forest and headed directly toward my station. Whatever had made those tracks had been following me the previous night. I took more photos, my hands shaking slightly despite the insulated gloves. That's when I noticed something else. Halfway up a nearby pine, about 8 feet off the ground, a clump of dark hair was snagged on the rough bark. I collected it in a sample bag, noting that it was far too coarse to be human, too long to be bear fur, and an unusual reddish-brown color I'd never seen on any local wildlife. As I sealed the bag, I heard branches snapping about 50 yards into the dense woods. Something large was moving parallel to my position, keeping pace but staying just out of sight. I called out the standard warning I use when I suspect a bear is nearby, keeping my voice firm and authoritative despite the fear crawling up my spine. The movement stopped. Then, after a moment of silence, a response came. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks against a tree trunk. Knock, knock, knock. The universal "I am here" signal used by hikers and search parties. But there were no hikers in this section. Not in October. Not this far from any trail. I returned to the station at a pace just shy of running, the entire way feeling watched by unseen eyes. That night, I lost radio contact completely as the storm intensified, covering the forest and another 8 inches of snow. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by something heavy moving on the station's roof. The old timbers groaned under a weight they weren't designed to bear. Then came the scratching at my door. Morning brought clarity and the return of radio communications. The storm had passed, leaving behind a winter wonderland and a message from headquarters. 2 hikers were missing in my sector. A couple in their 30s had set out 3 days ago on what was supposed to be an overnight trek. Their vehicle remained at the Aspen Trailhead parking area, but they hadn't returned. I gathered my search and rescue gear, medical kit, extra provisions, thermal blankets, GPS, and sidearm, and set out toward the Aspen Trail. The coordinates of their last known location put them about 7 miles east of my station, in difficult terrain, made more treacherous by the fresh snow. Search and rescue operations were routine parts of my job. Every year, unprepared hikers would underestimate the wilderness, bringing insufficient supplies or straying from marked trails. Usually we found them cold, hungry, and frightened, but alive. But something felt different about this search. Perhaps it was the tracks I'd found the previous days, or the strange sounds in the night. Whatever the reason, I approached this rescue with unusual caution. The hike to their last known coordinates took 3 hours through the snow. When I arrived at the spot, a small clearing that offered a spectacular view of the valley, I found evidence of a campsite. Their tent remained standing, partially collapsed under the weight of snow. Inside, I found sleeping bags, a camp stove, and personal belongings. Nothing appeared disturbed or damaged. It looked as if they had set up camp, gone for a short walk, and simply never returned. I checked their food supplies, barely touched. Their water filters and containers were still there. Most telling, their backpacks remained in the tent. No experienced hiker would venture far from camp without their pack. Something had interrupted their trip suddenly. I began searching and expanding circles around the campsite, calling their names and looking for tracks. The fresh snow had covered most evidence, but about 200 yards west of their camp, I found a disturbing scene partially preserved beneath an overhanging rock ledge that had shielded it from the snowfall. The ground was torn up with signs of a struggle. A broken hiking pole lay nearby. Most concerning was the series of large, humanoid tracks, identical to those I'd found at Miller's Creek, overlapping with what appeared to be the hikers' boot prints. My heart sank. The evidence suggested the couple had encountered something that had pursued them away from their camp. I followed the overlapping tracks as far as I could before the snow coverage made them impossible to discern, about a quarter mile into the densely wooded area west of the clearing. That's when I heard it, a faint call for help, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the forest. I moved toward the sound, calling out identification as a ranger. The voice responded, growing clearer as I approached a rocky outcropping. I found one of the missing hikers, a man in his early 30s, huddled in a natural hollow beneath the rocks. He was suffering from moderate hypothermia and a dislocated shoulder, but alive. "It took her," were his first words to me, eyes wide with terror. "We were just taking pictures of the sunset, and this thing came out of the trees. Huge, walking on 2 legs, but not human, not a bear either." I administered first aid, getting him stable enough to talk while I prepared a hot drink from my thermos. "It chased us," he continued, shivering uncontrollably. "We ran in different directions. I fell down this slope and crawled in here. I heard her screaming for a while, and then, nothing. I radioed headquarters to request backup and helicopter evacuation, but was told the earliest anyone could reach us would be morning due to conditions. We were on our own overnight. I set up an emergency shelter around the injured hiker, starting a small propane heater to raise his core temperature. As dusk approached, I debated our options. Protocol dictated staying with the injured survivor until evacuation, but his partner was still missing, potentially injured or worse. The hiker made the decision for me. "Please," he begged, "find her. I'll be okay here until morning." I left him with emergency supplies, my spare radio and flares, promising to return by dawn. Then I set out following what remained of the tracks from the struggle site, moving as quickly as failing light allowed. An hour into my search, I found a torn piece of red fabric. matching the jacket description of the missing woman, snagged on a branch about 6 feet off the ground. The surrounding area showed signs of something large having moved through recently, breaking branches and leaving intermittent depressions in the snow. Darkness fell completely, and I switched to my high-powered flashlight. The temperature dropped well below freezing. If the missing hiker was exposed to these elements without shelter, her survival chances diminished with every passing hour. 3 miles from where I'd found the injured man, I discovered a large downed tree with a hollow space beneath its massive root system. The snow around it showed signs of disturbance, and when I directed my light inside, I saw what appeared to be a collection of items. A torn backpack that wasn't from the hiker's camp, an old boot, several food wrappers, and disturbingly, a collection of ID cards and driver's licenses belonging to people I recognized from past missing persons reports. This wasn't a random encounter. Something, or someone, had been taking people from these woods for years. As I photographed this grim discovery, I heard movement in the forest behind me, heavy footsteps circling my position. I drew my sidearm, backing against the fallen tree and scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The beam caught a flash of movement about 40 yards away, something large and dark slipping between trees with surprising agility for its size. I caught only glimpses, reddish-brown hair, a massive silhouette that seemed to walk upright, and briefly, a pair of eyes reflecting my light. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping to scare off what I now suspected was a predator that had developed a taste for human prey. The figure retreated, crashing through underbrush as it moved away. But its departure provided something valuable, a clear trail to follow. The trail led deeper into the northwestern quadrant, an area so remote it hadn't been fully mapped since the original forest survey in the 1950s. Old-growth trees loomed overhead, their massive trunks creating natural pillars in the darkness. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as the elevation climbed, with jagged rock formations jutting from the earth like broken teeth. I maintained radio contact with the injured hiker, who reported no further disturbances at his location. Each check-in provided coordinates to the search team scheduled to arrive at first light, insurance in case I didn't make it back. The tracks I followed displayed a disturbing intelligence. Twice they led through freezing streams, seemingly an attempt to break the trail. Once they circled back behind my position, forcing me to stop and scan all directions before proceeding. Whatever I was tracking understood pursuit strategies. Around midnight, I reached a part of the forest I'd never seen before, a narrow valley between steep rock walls, sheltered from the worst of the winter weather. The snow here was shallower, and the signs of habitation were unmistakable. A crude structure stood at the valley's center, constructed from branches, bark, and forest debris. It resembled an enormous nest or den more than any human shelter, yet showed clear signs of deliberate construction. Around it, the ground was packed down from regular movement. I approached with extreme caution, sidearm ready. The smell hit me first, a powerful musky odor mixed with something putrid. The entrance to the structure was low, requiring even someone of my average height to stoop. I hesitated at the threshold, knowing that entering meant cornering myself if the builder returned. But the missing hiker could be inside. I ducked into the opening, flashlight scanning the interior. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, extending back into a natural cave formation in the rock wall. The ground was covered with branches, leaves, and my blood ran cold. Scraps of clothing and gear I recognized from the missing hiker's descriptions. In the rear of the cave, I found her. The missing woman was alive but in bad condition. She was partially covered with branches and leaves in what appeared to be a crude attempt at insulation. Her right leg was badly injured, a compound fracture that would require immediate medical attention. She was semi-conscious, mumbling incoherently when I identified myself. I administered emergency first aid, splinting her leg and preparing her for transport. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "It collects us," she whispered during one lucid moment, "brings us here, watches us, studies us." I radioed our position, requesting urgent evacuation and reporting that both hikers were found alive. The response was garbled, but confirmed help was on the way. We needed to move to open ground for helicopter extraction. As I prepared the injured woman for movement, a series of powerful vocalizations echoed through the valley, the same modulated howls I'd heard at my station, but now from multiple directions. A response pattern. They were communicating. They were coming back. I half-carried, half-dragged the injured hiker from the shelter, moving as quickly as her condition allowed toward a clearing about 500 yards away that could serve as an extraction point. The vocalizations grew closer, accompanied by the sounds of heavy movement through the forest from at least 3 directions. We reached the clearing just as the first massive figure emerged from the tree line opposite our position. In the moonlight, I finally saw it clearly, at least 7 feet tall, powerfully built, covered in reddish-brown hair. It moved with a fluid bipedal gait that was disturbingly human-like despite its massive frame. 2 more appeared at different points around the clearing, effectively surrounding us. I raised my sidearm, firing a warning shot that echoed across the valley. The figures hesitated but didn't retreat. Instead, they began a series of coordinated movements, spreading out in what I recognized with horror as a hunting formation. The injured woman beside me whimpered, "They're hurting us." I emptied my magazine into the air, creating enough noise to momentarily confuse them. In that brief window, I activated every emergency signal I had: flares, my emergency beacon, and a continuous distress call on my radio. The night sky lit up with red emergency flares, temporarily illuminating the clearing, and the massive figures now dropping to all fours to make themselves less visible targets. I caught details in the flare light: powerful shoulders, elongated arms, and faces that seemed caught between human and something else entirely. I've been a park ranger at Whispering Pines National Forest for 15 years. Most folks think the job's all sunny days guiding tourists and taking pictures with bears from a safe distance. Those people have never worked a graveyard shift during October when the temperature drops to freezing and every shadow between the trees seems to move. My outpost sits on the northwest ridge, 30 miles from the nearest ranger station and about 50 from anything resembling civilization. Cell reception is non-existent, and the satellite phone only works when the weather cooperates, which isn't often. Most rangers request transfers after 6 months up here. I've stayed because the isolation suits me. 3 days ago, I found the first set of tracks. They resembled human footprints but were nearly 18 inches long and twice as wide as my own boot. The stride length measured over 6 feet. Whatever left them would have stood well over 8 feet tall. I documented them as protocol requires, took photos, made plaster casts, and radioed it in as an unidentified large mammal sighting. My supervisor, Morgan, laughed it off. Probably just a black bear with deformed paws. Remember those mountain lion tracks last spring that turned out to be a lost hiker's snowshoes? But I knew bear tracks. These weren't bear tracks. That night, something circled my cabin. The motion sensors kept triggering, but when I'd shine my spotlight out the windows, I'd catch only glimpses of movement. Too tall and fluid to be a bear, too large for a human. The second night, it tried the doors. I sat in the dark with my service rifle across my lap, listening to the slow, methodical testing of each entry point. The handle on the back door turned slowly, then stopped when it wouldn't open. Something scratched at the window frames, not frantically like an animal, but with purpose, testing for weaknesses. By morning, I found every window and door frame marked with deep gouges about 7 feet up from the ground. When I radioed in again, Morgan was less amused. We've had 3 hikers go missing in the past month in that sector. Dispatch is sending Wilson and Rivera up tomorrow to help with a proper search. I didn't tell Morgan that I'd already found one of the missing hikers' backpacks 2 days ago, shredded and hanging 15 feet up in a pine tree, or about the strange musky odor that now permeated the woods around my outpost. Last night, it got worse. Around 2 a.m., a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard echoed through the valley. A deep, resonant howl that lasted for nearly a minute, vibrating through the cabin walls and settling into my bones. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote. It wasn't a bear. It was something ancient, something that didn't belong in these modern woods. In the morning, I found massive prints in the mud just 10 feet from my bedroom window. Standing inside, looking out at where they were positioned, I realized whatever made them had been standing there, looking in at me while I slept. I don't scare easily. You can't do this job if you do. But as I stare out into the darkening tree line now, watching shapes move just beyond where my vision can clearly define them, I have to ask myself, what exactly am I dealing with out here? And why, after all these years, has it decided to make itself known? The radio crackles. Wilson and Rivera won't make it until tomorrow. A storm's moving in. And something large just triggered the motion sensor at the edge of the clearing. Dawn broke with sheets of rain pounding against the metal roof of my cabin. The storm had intensified overnight, likely delaying Wilson and Rivera even further. But that wasn't my primary concern. The prints were everywhere now, circling the cabin completely, leading to and from the tree line in multiple directions. Some showed clear five-toed impressions the size of dinner plates. But strangest of all, some appeared to show knuckle marks, as if whatever made them had occasionally dropped to all fours. More disturbing was what I found hanging from the branches of a massive pine at the edge of the clearing. A deer carcass, freshly killed, suspended 15 feet up. Its neck had been broken, and its belly torn open with surgical precision. Not the work of any predator I'd encountered in 15 years of wilderness service. I spent the morning gathering supplies. If help wasn't coming, I'd need to conduct my own search for the missing hikers. The most recent disappearance was a graduate student named Jacobs, who'd been conducting research on fungal growth patterns. He'd missed 3 scheduled check-ins. By noon, the rain had subsided enough for me to set out. I followed the main trail for 6 miles before cutting northeast toward Jacobs' last known coordinates. The forest felt different, oppressively silent. No birdsong, no squirrels chattering. Even the insects seemed muted. 3 hours in, I found Jacobs' research site. His tent remained perfectly intact, zipped shut from the inside. His equipment was still arranged in meticulous order on a folding table under a tarp. His journal lay open. The final entry dated 5 days ago. Something's been watching the camp for the past 3 nights. I keep hearing bipedal movement in the underbrush after sunset. Too rhythmic to be an animal, too heavy to be a person. Park ranger assured me no predators large enough to be dangerous in this sector, but I'm relocating tomorrow regardless. But Jacobs never relocated. His sleeping bag showed signs he'd slept in the tent after writing that entry. A protein bar wrapper dated the following morning lay in his trash bag. What happened after breakfast that day? I searched a 300-yard perimeter around the camp. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. It was as if Jacobs had simply vanished into thin air, until I looked up. 20 feet above the tent, caught in the branches, was a shred of the same bright blue fabric as Jacobs's research jacket. And beside it, embedded deep in the bark, were 4 massive claw marks, unlike anything I'd ever seen. The wind picked up, carrying with it that same musky, pungent odor I'd noticed at my cabin. My radio crackled with sudden static. Then Morgan's voice broke through. "Repeat. All Rangers evacuate to main station immediately. We have confirmed hostiles in..." The transmission cut out. "Morgan, say again?" Nothing but static. That's when I heard it. Branches breaking in the distance, moving quickly toward me. Not the casual meanderings of a bear or deer, but the deliberate progress of something large moving with purpose. I shouldered my pack and drew my sidearm, scanning the surroundings. The forest had gone completely silent again. Whatever was approaching had stopped. For 10 long minutes I stood frozen listening. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. Then, from directly behind me, came a long, slow exhale of hot breath against the back of my neck. I didn't turn around. Some primal instinct screamed that facing whatever stood behind me would be the last mistake I ever made. Instead, I slowly slid my hand toward the bear spray on my belt while keeping my body as still as possible. The breathing continued. Deep, rhythmic inhales and exhales that smelled of raw meat and something else. Something earthy and ancient. I could feel the heat radiating from whatever it was, close enough that the hairs on my neck stood on end. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then a low rumbling sound emerged from just above my head, not quite a growl, more like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. It was trying to communicate. My fingers finally closed around the bear spray. In one fluid motion, I ducked, spun, and discharged the entire canister in an upward arc as I retreated backward. What I saw in that brief moment before turning to run has haunted me since. A massive silhouette, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark matted hair. Not the cartoonish Bigfoot of tabloids and campfire stories, but something leaner, more primal, its proportions almost human but wrongly elongated. Its face was mostly obscured, but I caught a glimpse of deep-set eyes reflecting the fading daylight. The spray hit its target. A roar of pain shattered the silence as I sprinted through the underbrush, abandoning the trail completely. Behind me, trees cracked and splintered as the creature gave chase. I've spent my career in these woods. I know every ridge, every ravine, every shortcut. That knowledge saved my life as I led my pursuer through the densest thickets, across a freezing stream, and up a near-vertical rock face that would force anything on 2 legs to slow down and climb deliberately. At the top of the ridge, I found what I was looking for, a small cave entrance barely visible behind a fallen tree. I squeezed inside, the rough stone scraping my back as I pressed myself as far back as possible. Outside, heavy footsteps approached, stopped, sniffing sounds. More of that rumbling vocalization. Something large blocked the fading light at the cave entrance, not trying to enter, but letting me know it could see me. For hours it maintained its vigil, occasionally moving away only to return minutes later. As darkness fell completely, it began arranging branches and rocks in front of the cave opening, not haphazardly, but methodically. It was creating a barrier. It was trying to trap me. My radio remained silent despite repeated attempts to reach Morgan or the main station. The storm had returned, rain now pouring down outside, turning the ground to mud. In the flashes of lightning, I caught glimpses of my captor, a massive silhouette moving with unsettling purpose. Around midnight, another sound cut through the storm. A second howl, similar to the first, but from much further away. My sentry immediately answered with its own call. A conversation was taking place. Then silence. I must have dozed off despite my terror, because I awoke to gray dawn light filtering through the branches. Cautiously, I approached the cave entrance and peered out. The barrier remained, but my captor was gone. In its place, arranged with deliberate care on a flat rock, was Jacobs's research journal, the one I'd seen in his tent the day before. Beside it lay a Park Service radio, not mine, which was still clipped to my belt, but standard issue, caked with dried mud. I recognized the ID number etched on its side. It belonged to Ranger Keller, who disappeared in these woods 2 years ago during a routine patrol. The implications were clear. Whatever was out there wanted me to know it had encountered my kind before. With trembling hands, I opened Jacobs's journal to find new writing on the final page. Crude, childlike letters pressed deeply into the paper. We were here first. I made it back to my outpost just before noon, constantly scanning my surroundings and stopping to listen for pursuit. The forest had returned to normal. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, wind rustling through the pines. Whatever had stalked me seemed to have withdrawn, at least temporarily. My cabin appeared undisturbed until I noticed the back door, which I'd locked before leaving, standing slightly ajar. Inside, nothing was damaged or taken, but everything had been examined. Drawers pulled open just an inch, cupboards unlatched, books tilted out from the shelf as if someone had been looking at their spines. Most unsettling was my bed. The covers had been pulled back and the pillow bore a deep depression, as if something had lain there, perhaps trying to understand its purpose. With shaking hands, I laid out the evidence I'd gathered. The plaster casts of footprints, photographs, my own journal entries, Jacobs's journal with its ominous final message, and Keller's mud-encrusted radio. For years, reports of strange encounters had filtered through the Ranger Service. Most were dismissed as overactive imaginations, wildlife misidentifications, or hoaxes. Those that couldn't be easily explained were buried in paperwork and forgotten, officially at least. But Rangers talked. Around campfires and in quiet corners of outposts, stories were shared. A pattern emerged across decades of reports. Missing hikers in remote sectors. Strange vocalizations unlike known wildlife. Shelters found destroyed in ways animals couldn't manage. Footprints that didn't match known species. And always the sense of being watched by something intelligent. I dismissed these stories myself until 3 days ago. Now, staring at the evidence spread before me, I could no longer deny what I was dealing with. The Park Service classified them as non-registered indigenous inhabitants, a deliberately vague term buried in subsection 47B of the Wilderness Management Protocols. We were instructed to document but not engage, report but not publicize. These protocols existed for a reason, I now understood. My satellite phone finally connected after multiple attempts. Morgan's voice came through, tense and hurried. "Where the hell have you been? We've been trying to reach you for days." "Something's out here, Morgan. Something that took Jacobs and Keller before him." A long pause. "Wilson and Rivera reported the same thing before we lost contact with them. They found tracks near the eastern ridge yesterday morning. We haven't heard from them since." My blood ran cold. "You need to send an evacuation team." "Already did. Full tactical unit. They're headed to your position now, ETA 3 hours. Just stay put. Keep your weapons ready." As I ended the call, movement caught my eye through the window. Just a flash of dark fur between distant trees. Then another, further to the right. And another. They were surrounding the cabin again. But this time in daylight. This time there were more of them. I counted at least 5 distinct figures moving through the tree line. Too distant and obscured to make out clearly, but unmistakably large and bipedal. They made no effort to hide their presence now. This wasn't stalking behavior. It was a show of force. A deliberate message. You are outnumbered. The radio crackled to life. "Ranger Outpost, this is Tactical Unit Bravo. We are inbound, 20 miles from your position. Any activity to report." I raised the radio to respond when a stone crashed through my window, landing on the floor beside me. Wrapped around it was a strip of fabric from Wilson's uniform shirt, still bearing his name tag, stained dark with dried blood. Tactical Unit Bravo never made it to my outpost. Their last transmission came when they were approximately 5 miles out. A garbled message about blocked roads and vehicle malfunctions. Then silence. The satellite phone went dead shortly after, leaving me completely isolated as dusk approached. Outside, my unwelcome visitors had retreated to the tree line, but remained visible. Dark silhouettes that occasionally moved between trunks, maintaining their loose perimeter around the clearing. They were waiting for nightfall. I took stock of my situation. Ammunition for my rifle and sidearm, enough food and water for several days, and a dwindling supply of propane for the generator. If I lost power, I'd lose lights. My most effective deterrent against whatever was out there. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, the first call came. That same haunting howl I'd heard nights before, but now answered immediately by 4 or 5 others from different directions. The message was clear. They were coordinating. The motion sensors began triggering one after another around the perimeter of the cabin. On the security monitors, I caught fragments of movement. A massive arm here, a silhouetted head there, always just at the edge of the camera's range. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted me to see them. At midnight, the first direct approach came. Heavy footsteps on the porch. Then 3 deliberate knocks on the front door. Not frantic animal scratching, intentional communication. I positioned myself out of sight with my rifle trained on the entrance, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard through the walls. More knocking, then something unexpected. A voice. Rough and halting but unmistakably forming words. "Ranger, come, out!" My hands shook on the rifle. In 15 years of wilderness service, through every strange report and campfire story, no one had ever mentioned them speaking. "We know you're listening," the voice continued, clearer now, as if gaining confidence. "We've watched your kind for generations, learned your words, your ways." I remained silent, frozen in place. "The others," the voice hesitated. "They came too far. Marked trees, dug ground, more each season. This stops." With terrible clarity, I understood. The recent expansions of hiking trails, the new research stations, the increased patrols. We'd been encroaching on their territory, pushing further into the remote areas they'd claimed. "What do you want?" I finally managed to call out, voice barely steady. A pause. "Agreement, boundaries. Your people stay on marked paths. We stay in deep woods. No crossing." "And if we don't agree?" A low rumbling sound that might have been laughter. "Then more disappear, like the others, until you learn." My mind raced through options. I had no authority to negotiate territory boundaries with whatever these were, but I also had no backup, no communication, and limited supplies. "I need to contact my supervisors," I said. "I can't make agreements alone." Another pause. 3 days. You go to your people, return with answer. If no return, we consider refused. Before I could respond, heavy footsteps retreated from the porch. On the monitors, the figures melted back into the forest one by one. By morning, the clearing was empty. Cautiously, I opened the door to find a crude map drawn in the dirt. Lines clearly depicting the current hiking trails and research outposts, with a boundary marked beyond them. Their proposed territory. Attached to my vehicle was a small bundle of fur. Not threatening, but a reminder of who I'd be dealing with. As I drove down the mountain toward headquarters, my mind struggled to process the night's events. What I'd tell my supervisors, whether they'd believe me. What might happen if we refused the proposed agreement. One thing was certain. The wilderness I'd thought I knew for 15 years harbored secrets far older and more intelligent than anyone had suspected. We weren't the first to claim these forests, and perhaps we never truly owned them at all. In my rearview mirror, a tall figure stood watching from the tree line until I turned the bend and lost sight of the outpost. I would return in 3 days with an answer. The future of the park, and possibly much more, depended on it.